The cold bites into his bones so deeply that his skin ceases to be skin and becomes mere flesh in the frost. He lies naked on a pelt in a stone burrow. All around him are filthy people in pelts, their faces devoid of any familiar expression. A woman raises a stone, and suddenly he realizes where he is. The Paleolithic era. He doesn't remember how he got here, just a dull pain in the back of his head and a smell. Smoke, sweat, fat, blood. His body won't obey him. He can't feel his toes. He tries to sit up, and the world sways so sharply that his stomach rises to his throat. The woman raises the stone higher. Someone to his left growls. Doesn't speak, just growls. Short and muffled, like a warning. And then his gaze latches onto the bonfire. The fire is dying right now. The coals are still smoldering, but they're already speckled with gray ash, and every second drains the life from them. The fire will go out. Either the cold or the stone in this woman's fist will finish him off. He sits down. Slowly. Very slowly. Without taking his eyes off the stone. His hand reaches not toward the people, toward the fire. A dry twig lies next to the embers. To these people, it's trash. To him, it's life. He rakes the twig toward the hottest ember. He leans over and blows, quietly, steadily, just as he was taught as a child, just as he'd done 100 times at the dacha and on camping trips. The ember shudders. It glows red. The twig smolders. Then it flares up. A tongue of flame rises above the coals and sways. The woman lowers the stone. She doesn't throw it. She lowers it. And that is his first word in this new world. A thin wisp of smoke rising toward the stone vault spoke louder than any word. He looks around. The cave is about 10 meters deep. People lie on animal skins along the walls. He counts 12 right here, and further into the darkness, he can make out even more bodies. Somewhere, a child is coughing. A wet, wrenching cough. And no one gets up to tend to him. Either they've grown accustomed to it, or they know they can't help. He tosses another twig into the fire. The flame grows stronger. It gets brighter, and he sees faces. Not animal-like, human, tired, hungry. The man on the right has his arm wrapped in a brown rag. He holds it outstretched and winces in pain. Behind him, a woman has a child on her lap with a swollen belly and legs like sticks. Hunger. He'd seen this in photographs, but never in person. Against the far wall, an old man sways back and forth, muttering. The words are foreign. The language is foreign, but he recognizes the rhythm. A prayer. Or an incantation. A shaman. He doesn't realize this from the bones and teeth on a string hanging from the old man's neck. He realizes it from the way the others keep their distance from him, with a respect that's indistinguishable from fear. The shaman stops swaying and fixes his gaze on him. His eyes are dark, alert, not mad, intelligent. The old man throws 2 or 3 words at the others. The woman with the stone replies. The old man shakes his head. The woman places the stone on the ground nearby. She doesn't put it away. She places it so she can grab it again. They've decided not to kill him. For now. That word will be the most important one for the coming days. Everything is for now. The fire warms him, but his body is still shaking. He needs a hide, at least something between his skin and the cold. He wraps his arms around his shoulders. He rubs his hands together. A universal gesture. I'm cold. The woman watches for a few seconds. She stands up. She walks off into the darkness. She returns with a piece of fur. Old. Stinky. Full of holes. She tosses it at his feet. She doesn't hand it to him. She tosses it. Like you'd toss a dog a blanket. He grabs it. Throws it over his shoulders. It stinks so bad it makes his eyes water. But the hide is warm. And right now that's all that matters. He sits by the fire and tries to sort through his thoughts. Facts. He needs facts. He's naked. He's in a cave. People in hides surround him. The language is foreign. Zero technology. The fire is barely burning. The children are sick. There's not a scrap of food to be seen. Outside the walls, the wind howls, and by the sound of it, it's winter. Either he's gone mad, and this is the delirium of a dying brain on an icy staircase, Or he really is here. And if he is here, then this is the Paleolithic era. And in that case, he has exactly one advantage over everyone else in this hole. He knows things. Not magic, not superpowers. Things. How to make fire out of nothing. How to catch a beast without chasing it with a spear. How to preserve meat for a month. How to stitch up a wound so a person doesn't rot alive. How to lift a stone that can't be lifted by hand. All of this is in his head. The trouble is that a head without hands is useless, and the hands here belong to someone else. And these foreign hands must first need to be convinced. He sits by the fire until morning. He adds twigs. He tends the flame. By dawn, he has learned his first word. The woman gets up and throws something to one of the men. A short word. He hears it 3 times in an hour and catches the meaning. Water. He repeats it aloud. Quietly. The woman turns around. There is neither warmth nor hatred in her eyes. Only assessment. She decides whether he is worth the water. Then she nods to someone. They bring him water in something like a bladder, an animal's bladder. The water is ice cold and smells of blood. He drinks. It's his first breakfast in this new world. In the morning, the cave comes to life. People get up with difficulty. They pull on their animal skins. The men gather at the entrance. There are 6 of them, with spears. The spears are crude. Wooden shafts with crooked stone tips on them. The wrappings are loose. He looks at these spears and feels both afraid and exhilarated at the same time. Afraid because going after a serious beast with these is suicide. Exhilarated because he knows how to do it better. Much better. But right now, he's nobody. A naked stranger who wasn't killed only because he managed to keep the fire going. The men leave. He spends the day observing, counting. There are about 30 people in the cave. 6 men are fit for battle. 3 of the children are coughing. There's no food at all. A woman scrapes an old bone, gnawing out the remains of the marrow. A teenager chews a piece of rawhide just to stave off hunger. A mother presses her child to her breast, and the child cries because there is no milk. This is very bad. The hunters return in the evening, empty-handed. No carcass, no blood on their spears. One is limping. Another is clutching his side. They sit by the fire and say nothing. He knows this silence, the silence of people who understand that tomorrow will be worse than today. The shaman stands up. He approaches the fire. He speaks softly and rhythmically. Then he points his finger at one of the 2 emaciated dogs by the entrance, dogs with ribs sticking out. He understands. The shaman suggests slaughtering the dog to feed the tribe. The logic of the dying. Devour the last of what's left to make it through the day. Then the second to last. Then each other. He stands up. Everyone is looking at him. He doesn't know the words. But they aren't needed. He walks toward the exit. Looks outside. Snow, trees, twilight, and a trail. A narrow trail in the snow leading to the stream he'd been hearing all night. And along the trail, tracks. Small, split tracks. Hooves. A roe deer. Someone goes to the water. Every day. Along the same path. He turns toward the tribe. Points at the path. Points at the tracks. Clenches his fist. Unclenches his hand. Clenches it again. A trap. To catch. To take. No one understands. But the woman with the stone approaches the exit. She looks at the tracks. Then at him. And in her eyes the first spark flares up. Not of distrust. Of curiosity. She wants to know what he's up to. This is the beginning. The morning began with a cough. 3 children were coughing so hard that the cave walls seemed to tremble from the sound. One of the mothers held a girl of about 3 close to her and rocked back and forth with her. The girl was burning up. He could tell by her face. Red cheeks, cloudy eyes, dry, cracked lips, a fever. He knew what needed to be done, but he had nothing. No willow bark, no clean water, no rag. Only his hands and a mind in which knowledge spun uselessly. He turned away from the girl. Not because he didn't care, because right now, there was only one way he could save her. Feed the tribe. A well-fed tribe will survive. A hungry one will devour itself. He left the cave at dawn. The cold hit his face like a plank. The snow crunched under his bare feet, and every step was painful. He needed shoes. But first, the traps. He approached the woman with the stone, Nay. He didn't know her name yet, but he'd memorized her face. Sharp cheekbones, dark eyes, and a scar on her left arm stretching from her wrist to her elbow. He gestured to her. I need people, young ones, strong arms, to come with me. She looked at him for a long time. Then she turned and shouted something into the cave. 3 teenagers came out, 2 boys and a girl. One of the boys was big for his age, broad-shouldered, with a heavy jaw and eyes full of malice, not directed at him personally, but at the world in general, at hunger, at winter, at everything. This boy spat in his direction. He missed. But the message was clear. You're a nobody. He didn't react. He turned and walked toward the stream. After 10 steps, he looked back. All 3 were following him, even the one who'd spat. Hunger is stronger than pride. He led them to the trail. The tracks were fresh. Someone had come to the water during the night. A roe deer, maybe 2. He looked around. He found a young sapling, supple, as thick as 2 fingers, flexible enough to bend into an arc without snapping. He gestured to the teenagers. Bend it, tie it. They didn't understand. He set to work himself. He bent the sapling to the ground, held it down with one hand. With the other, he indicated they needed a rope, a sinew, anything. A teenage girl was the first to understand. She ran off to the cave and returned with a piece of tendon, rough, twisted, but strong. He tied the tendon to the top of the sapling, made a loop, demonstrated how the trap worked. A split bone, a small stick as a strut. When the hoof steps on the tendon, the stick pops out, the bone releases the branch, and the noose snares the leg. Simple, elementary. It took him 20 minutes to set the first noose. The teenagers watched in silence. He moved 10 steps further down the trail, set the second one, then the third, a fourth. Each one took less and less time. By the fourth, the guy who'd spat suddenly crouched down beside him and held out his hand. Not to help, but to touch. He touched the trap. He twirled the split bone between his fingers. He was trying to understand. He didn't stop him. They returned to the cave. Waiting was the hardest part. He sat by the fire, shivering. His body refused to warm up. He was shivering, and he realized he was starting to get sick. No surprise there. A naked man from the 21st century, with no immunity to local parasites and infections, out in the cold in a stone cave. It was a wonder he hadn't collapsed yet. The shaman Urka sat across from him and watched him. Not hostilely, studying, like a biologist observing a new species. Then he stood up and walked deeper into the cave. He returned with something in his hand. He held it out, a piece of dried meat. Small, tough as a shoe sole, but meat. He took it, chewed slowly, squeezed every drop of juice from this rock that had once been the flesh of a living beast. The shaman nodded. He didn't smile, he just nodded, and he returned to his place. He remembered, the shaman isn't afraid of him, the shaman is studying him. And that might turn out to be more dangerous than open hostility. By noon, he couldn't take it anymore. He stood up and walked toward the trail, alone, without the teenagers, without a weapon, with a single thought in his mind. If the snares were empty, it meant he'd been wrong. It meant the tracks were old. It meant he'd wasted the morning and the trust he didn't have to begin with. The first snare was empty. The second was empty. The third was empty. He felt something tighten inside him. Not fear, worse, disappointment in himself. He reached the fourth snare, a roe deer, alive, struggling. The snare had wrapped around its hind leg, and a small tree, bent into an arch, held the animal aloft. The roe deer twitched and wheezed. Its eyes were wild with terror. He stood there looking at it, his hands trembling. Not from the cold, from relief. He ran back. He burst into the cave. He pointed. There, go, look. The teenagers went first, then the women, then the rest. When they saw the roe deer in the snare, silence fell. The kind of silence that comes only when people witness the impossible. The animal was trapped. Without a hunt. No spear, no blood, no risk. The animal had simply come to the water and been caught. That teenager, the one who had spat, he slowly sank to his knees. His forehead touched the frozen ground. Not before him, before the roe deer, or before something he couldn't put into words. Before the fact that the world had just changed. He placed his on the boy's shoulder, and he spoke 10 words in the tribe's broken language, which he'd learned in 2 days. Not to me, to the river, to the fire, to you. He didn't know exactly what he'd said in their system of meanings. Maybe nonsense. Maybe he'd said something indecent rather than a thank you. But from their expressions, he knew he'd hit the mark. They butchered the roe deer right there on the trail, quickly, skillfully. The women worked on the carcass the way he worked on blueprints, precisely and without any unnecessary movements. They collected the blood in a leather bag. They didn't throw away the bones. They spread the hide out on the snow. They set the tendons aside separately. Nothing went to waste. In this world, nothing went to waste. By evening, the cave smelled of roasted meat. The smell was so strong it made his head spin. They roasted the meat on stones by the fire, roughly, without salt, without spices. But it was hot meat after days of hunger, and for these people, it was a miracle. They gave him a piece. Not the first one, not the best one, but they gave him some, without him asking. One of the hunters silently placed a chunk of thigh meat in front of him. Hot, still bloody, smelling of smoke. He ate and thought. 1 roe deer for 30 people is nothing. It's just 1 dinner. Tomorrow they'll be hungry again. But tomorrow he'll set not 4 snares, but 10. And he'll show the teenagers how to set them themselves. And in a week, snares will be set along the entire stream. And then maybe, just maybe, they'll have time. Time for everything else. For a fire, for tools, for warmth. For those 3 coughing children to make it through to spring. At night, he lay on the stinking hide and counted. 30 people, 6 hunters, 2 streams, 1 forest. How many calories does a person need per day in the cold? About 3,000. 90,000 for 30 people. A roe deer yields about 20 kilograms of meat. About 1,000 calories per kilogram. 20,000 calories. That would last 30 people less than a day. He needed 5 roe deer a day, or 1 moose, or another approach. Traps, fish, small game, all together. And storage, smoking, drying, so that what's caught today would feed them a week from now. His brain worked like an assembly line. Task, resources, constraints, solution. He was thinking in Russian, and it felt strange. Thinking in Russian in a Stone Age cave, as if 2 worlds had overlapped. In one, he was a process engineer at a factory near Kaluga. In the other, he was a naked, frozen stranger who'd been thrown a pelt like a dog. But in both worlds, the task was the same. To keep everything from falling apart, and he knew how to do it. At dawn on the 3rd day, a young man approached him, tall, strong, with a face that radiated a sense of superiority honed over the years. The chieftain's son. He knew this from the way the others parted before him, from the way they looked at him, up from below. The young man stood over him. He said something, sharp, brief. Then he bent down and took his piece of meat, the one they'd left for him the night before. He took it, openly, in front of everyone. He didn't move. He didn't stand up. He didn't clench his fists. He looked the guy in the eyes and slowly nodded. Take it. Not because he was a coward, because he knew. You can't fight someone who's physically stronger than you when the only thing you have is your head. Your head won't withstand a blow from a stone fist, but a stone fist won't be able to withstand what your head comes up with someday. The guy walked away with the meat. The tribe watched. Some looked away. Others smirked. Nay stood at the entrance, motionless. Her face was expressionless. But an hour later, she silently placed a piece of sinewy meat from yesterday's roe deer in front of his hide. He looked at her. She didn't look back. She turned and walked away. Artem set 4 snares on the animal trail by the stream and caught a roe deer. This earned him the tribe's first respect. Braun, the chief's son, had openly humiliated him by taking his food. Artem didn't resist and gave up the meat. Nay secretly brought him another piece. On the 4th day, he set 10 snares. On the 5th, he caught 2 hares. On the 6th, another roe deer. The tribe ate. Not to their fill, but they ate every day. And that changed everything. Their faces changed. Not immediately, not all at once. But he saw it. Eyes that had been empty and lifeless from hunger began to move, to look, to notice. Hunger robs a person of the ability to think, and when food returns, thought returns with it. And this thought was dangerous for him. Because the first thing a well-fed person thinks about is where the food comes from and whether they can do without the one who brings it. On the seventh day, he decided it was time to make a fire. Not to keep the old one going, to make a new one, from scratch. He found a suitable plank, a flat piece of dry wood. He found a stick, sturdy and straight. He stripped the bark off it. With a stone fragment, he carved a depression into the plank. Next to the depression, he cut a groove. For tinder. He made the tinder from birch bark. He peeled off a thin layer. He rubbed it between his fingers until it broke into fibers. He placed it in the groove. Then he made a bow. A flexible twig. A bowstring. He wrapped the bowstring around the stick. One end of the stick went into the indentation on the plank. He pressed the other end down from above with a stone with a small hole in it. And he began to move the bow. Back and forth, steadily, quickly. The stick began to spin in the groove. Smoke appeared after 20 seconds. A minute later, brown powder began to smolder in the groove. He transferred the smoldering tinder to a nest of birch fibers. He brought it to his mouth. He blew on it. Fire. Alive. Real. Out of nothing. He did it in the middle of the cave in broad daylight, in front of everyone. He did it on purpose, in front of everyone. Because what he needed wasn't fire. It was a reaction. And the reaction exceeded anything he could have imagined. The tribe froze. People stood and sat with their mouths agape, staring at the flame in his hands as if it were a miracle. Because for them, it was a miracle. Fire in this world was a treasure. They guarded it. They carried it in embers. Entire clans died out because their hearths went out. If the fire died, they had to go to their neighbors and ask for some, or wait for a thunderstorm, or rub sticks together for hours until their hands were covered in bloody blisters, hoping for luck. But he made fire in a minute, with a stick and a string. The shaman Urka stood up. He walked over. He wasn't looking at the fire but at the bow drill. He stared at it for a long time. Then he looked up, and in those eyes, he saw what he had feared. Not admiration, fear. The shaman was afraid, not of him, of what he had brought, of what fire created from nothing meant. If a stranger can make fire from a stick, then what's the point of a shaman? If a beast can be caught in a snare made of sinew, then what's the point of a drum? If the world can be understood with one's hands, then what's the point of spirits? Urka turned to the tribe. He spoke, quietly, calmly. They didn't understand the words, but they understood the tone. The shaman wasn't shouting or threatening. He was explaining. He was warning them. He spoke of spirits, of wrath, of the natural order of things that must not be disrupted. The people listened. Some nodded. Some glanced at him. He stood there with a bow drill in his hand, realizing he had just opened a second front. The first was hunger. The second was the shaman. And the second was more dangerous. Hunger was blunt and direct. The shaman was clever and patient. That evening he made a second bow drill, and a third. And he showed the teenagers how to use them. That guy who spat on the first day? His name was Took. He found this out because the other teenagers called out to him. Took was stubborn and angry, and he had golden hands. He mastered the drill in an hour. He made a fire on his third try. By the fifth, he was doing it confidently. By the 10th, he was faster than Artem himself. The second teenager, a boy named Silo, was slower but more meticulous. He didn't just copy what he saw. He watched and thought. Why the groove? Why this particular type of wood? What would happen if he pulled the bowstring tighter? A teenage girl. Uni, the shaman's daughter. He found that out later. She didn't try to learn how to make fire. She sat down next to him and watched. Not the drill, him. And when he finished demonstrating, she asked something. One word. He didn't understand. She repeated it. She pointed at the drill, then at her head, then at him. He understood. Where from? She was asking where he knew that from. He didn't know how to answer. He pointed at the sky, then at the ground, then at his own head. Ridiculous, absurd. But she nodded, as if she understood. On the 8th day, a blizzard struck. The wind howled so loudly that the cave walls hummed. Snow clogged the entrance, and they had to clear it away every hour. The temperature dropped so low that even by the fire, their teeth were chattering. He sat by the fire and watched as Nay sealed the cave entrance with animal hides. She stretched them over the sticks. She plugged the cracks with moss and clumps of snow. Rough but effective. He stood up and helped. Silently, without explanation. He simply took the edge of a pelt and pulled it tighter. Tied it to a rock with a knot. Not a regular one. The one he'd known from his days as a hiker. A bowline. Simple. Reliable. It doesn't come undone under strain. Nay looked at the knot. She tugged at it. It didn't come undone. She tugged harder. It held. She looked at him. For the first time differently. Not like a rat. Not like a stranger. Like a tool. A useful tool. It wasn't respect, not yet. But it was recognition. He exists. He can do something others can't. And that something is useful. The blizzard lasted 3 days. 3 days in the cave. 30 people in a stone sack. The smell of sweat and smoke and urine and rotting skin. The children's coughing. The howling of the wind. Darkness in which the only light was the campfire. He used those 3 days. He sat by the fire and learned the language. He listened. He repeated. By the end of the blizzard, he knew 50 words. Water, fire, meat, cold, stone, wood, hand, foot, walk, run, eat, sleep, big, small, hurt, good, give, take, man, woman, child, beast, names, nay, talk, brawn, gore, urka. He memorized everything. Every word settled into his memory like a brick in a wall. He was building a bridge, word by word, because without language, he was a deaf-mute genius. Useless. On the 11th day, the blizzard subsided. The world outside the cave was white and quiet and vast. The snow lay knee-deep. The trees stood like white pillars. The stream hadn't frozen over, but was hidden beneath a crust of ice. The snares were buried. He went to check them with Took and Silo. 2 out of 10 had hairs in them, frozen, suffocated in the snares under the snow. Unfit food for a world of plenty. Salvation for the hungry. They carried the hairs back, and Took walked beside him, trying to talk to him. Slowly, clearly, the way one speaks to a child or a foreigner. He pointed to the trees and named them. He pointed to the tracks and named the animals. He pointed to the sky and said a word that meant either snow or winter or cold. He repeated it. Took corrected him. Silo remained silent and listened. They returned to the cave and he saw something new. Standing at the entrance was a man he hadn't seen before. No, he had seen him before, but he hadn't paid any attention. Old Gore, the chief. He was old. He was weak. He stood leaning on a staff and watched the 3 of them return with 2 hairs in their hands. Standing next to him was Braun, the chief's son, the very one who had taken his meat. Gore said something, quietly. Braun grimaced but said nothing. Gore pointed at the hairs, then at him. Then he said something else and went back into the cave. Braun stayed. He stood there looking down at him. Then he turned and walked away. He didn't know what the chieftain had said, but it was clear from Braun's expression that he didn't like it. That evening, he began working on something that could change everything. An atlatl. A spear thrower. A stick as long as an arm, with a hook at the end that holds the rear end of the spear. The principle of a lever. The arm is extended by the length of the thrower's arm, and the spear flies 2 or 3 times farther. He knew the design. He'd seen them in museums. He'd made them at reenactment festivals. But those were festivals with ready-made materials and steel knives. Here, he had only a stone scraper and his own hands. He worked for 3 evenings. He planed, he cut, he tested it. The first atlatl came out crooked and flimsy. He broke it and started over. The second one was better. He carved the hook at the end out of bone, polished it against a stone, tied it with sinew, tightened the knot, checked its flexibility. On the 4th evening, he emerged from the cave with the atlatl and a spear, a light, short spear he'd made specifically for the throwing device. And he threw it. The spear flew far, 35 paces, maybe 40. Not a record, but for the Paleolithic era, it was like a gun. Braun stood at the entrance. He saw the throw. His eyes widened. He took a step forward, then another, Then he approached and held out his hand. "Give it to me." Silently, without malice, only greed. The greed of a hunter who had seen a weapon that could change everything. He handed it over. Braun took the atlatl. He inserted the spear. He threw it. The spear flew 20 paces, off target. Braun frowned. He threw again. 25. One more time. 30. Again. 35. Again. 40. He was a quick learner. The hunter's body, accustomed to the spear, absorbed the mechanics of the spear thrower like a sponge soaks up water. After 10 throws, Braun hurled the spear 45 paces, and it lodged itself in the trunk of a birch tree with a sound that made even him flinch. Braun looked at it, for the first time, without hatred, without contempt, without superiority, with something that wasn't quite respect yet, but was no longer hostility. Artem created a bow drill and showed the tribe how to make fire from scratch. This frightened the shaman Urka, who saw it as a threat to his authority. Artem crafted an atlatl and gave it to Braun. For the first time, Braun looked at him without hatred. The teenagers, Tuk and Silo, began to help Artem of their own accord. On the 14th day, the boy cut his leg open. Silo, quiet, careful Silo, stepped on a bone sticking out from under the snow, and a sharp shard sliced his shin from his knee to the middle of his calf. Blood gushed out immediately, bright red. On the white snow, it looked like paint from an overturned bucket. Silo fell. He didn't scream. He hissed through clenched teeth and clamped his hands over the wound. Blood flowed between his fingers. He was nearby, just 3 steps away. He grabbed the boy under the armpits and dragged him toward the cave. Tuk ran ahead, shouting something. The people parted. He laid Silo down on a hide by the fire and looked at the wound. Deep, down to the muscle. Not down to the bone, but close. The bleeding was heavy, but not arterial. Arterial blood spurts out like a fountain. This blood was flowing in a stream. He knew what to do. He knew in theory. In practice, he had never sewn up a living person, but practice was a luxury he didn't have. He shouted, "Water!" He knew that word. Hot. He didn't know that word. He pointed to the fire and to the water. Nay understood. She brought a leather bag. He placed red-hot stones from the fire into it. The water hissed. The smell of burnt skin and steam filled the air. He waited until the water was hot enough. He rinsed the wound. Silo flinched and whimpered. 2 men held him by the shoulders. He rinsed and examined the wound. Dirt, clumps of earth, fragments of bone. He removed everything he could, with his fingers, carefully. Then he rinsed it again. Now he needed a needle. Thread. He turned to Nay. He gestured. A thin bone, sharp, with a hole in it, and a tendon, a thin tendon. Nay looked at him for a second. Then she left. She returned 5 minutes later with a bone needle and a skein of thin tendon. The needle was rough, thick. The hole in it had been drilled unevenly, but it was a needle. He heated it over the fire. He singed the tip of the tendon. It wasn't sterile suture material. It was what they had. The shaman Urka approached. He stood nearby. He watched. He didn't interfere. He didn't help. He watched. He began to sew. The first stitch was terrible. His hands were shaking. The needle went in crooked. Silo screamed. The second stitch was better. The third was straighter. By the 5th, his hands had stopped shaking, and he was working on autopilot. Like a machine, stitch by stitch, evenly, neatly. The tension was even. The wound was closing. The edges of the skin were coming together. The blood had stopped flowing. 12 stitches. He counted 12. Then he rinsed the suture with hot water once more, and he paused to think. A bandage. He needed a clean bandage. He remembered. Moss. Sphagnum. Bog moss. Naturally sterile. It absorbs liquid better than any bandage. An antiseptic. He'd seen the moss by the stream, green cushions on the rocks. He dashed out of the cave. He ran barefoot through the snow and didn't feel the cold. He found the moss. He tore off a clump. He returned. He lined the wound with moss, covered it with a piece of soft leather, bandaged it with a sinew. Silo lay there, pale but alive. He was breathing. The bleeding had stopped. He sat down beside him and only then noticed that the entire cave was watching him. All 30 people, in silence. The shaman Urka stood closest to him. His face was impassive. His eyes were dark. He remained silent longer than anyone else. Then he turned and walked deeper into the cave, without a word, without a gesture. He left. Nay approached. She sat down nearby, not next to Silo, next to him. And she sat there in silence until he fell asleep. He woke up to a scream. In the middle of the night. It was a woman's scream, high-pitched, brief. He jumped up. A man was standing at the cave entrance. A stranger, not from their tribe, clad in dark animal skins, carrying a spear, his face smeared with something black. In the light of the fire, his eyes gleamed like a beast's. The man looked into the cave. He counted the people. He assessed them. Then he turned and vanished into the darkness. Quietly, quickly, as if he'd never been there. The tribe stirred. Women grabbed their children. The men reached for their spears. Nay was already standing at the entrance, spear in hand, peering into the night. Gore stepped forward. The old chieftain. He spoke a single word. He didn't know that word, but from the way the people's faces paled, he understood its meaning. Strangers. Enemies. Someone had come. Morning brought traces, many traces. There were footprints in the snow around the cave. 5, maybe 6. They had walked in circles. They had looked. They had counted. And they had gone west. Gore gathered the hunters. He spoke at length. His voice was quiet and steady, but it carried the weight of stone. He didn't understand everything, but he grasped the main point. The Blackstones. That was the name of the foreign tribe. They were to the west. A large tribe. A strong one. A hungry one. And they already knew about the caves of the Grey River. A scout had been here. He'd seen the fire. He'd seen people. And he'd left to tell his people. Bronn stood next to his father, gripping his spear. His atlatl hung from his belt. In 2 weeks, he'd grown as accustomed to the throwing stick as to his own hand. He could throw it 50 paces. Accurately. With force. But Bronn alone, with his atlatl, against an entire tribe was nothing. He walked over to Gore, stood beside him, pointed west, pointed at the cave, then pointed at the ground in front of the entrance, and began to draw, with a stick on the trampled snow. The cave, the entrance, the trail, the stream, the forest. He was drawing a map, the first map these people had ever seen in their lives. Gore watched. Bronn watched. Nay stepped closer. He pointed to the trail coming from the west. He pointed to the cave's entrance. Then he drew crosses. Small crosses on the trail. Traps. Not for animals, for people. Pits. Rocks tied to ropes. Logs. Everything he knew from books, movies, and survival forums. Only this time, it wasn't for fun. It was for survival. Gore listened in silence. Then he looked at Bronn. Bronn looked at him. And nodded. For the first time. Briefly. Sharply. Like an acknowledgement, not of him personally, of his usefulness. For the next 3 days, he worked non-stop. From morning until dark. With Took and 2 hunters Gore had assigned. They dug pits along the western trail. Shallow ones. Knee-deep. Deep enough for a man running in the dark to trip and fall. They placed sharp stakes made of charred wood at the bottom of the pits. They stretched ropes between the trees at ankle height. They hung stones from branches that would fall when the rope was pulled tight. Rough. Primitive. But in the dark on an unfamiliar trail, that would be enough to stop or slow down anyone. He worked and thought. Traps are protection. Protection is time. Time is opportunity. But traps won't solve the problem. The problem is that the Blackstones are stronger. There are more of them. They're hungrier. And hunger would drive them here sooner or later. He needed something else. Not a wall. A bridge. Or a wall so high that climbing over it would cost more than making a deal. On the 17th day, he began building a smokehouse. It was an idea that seemed insane in a world where people didn't know the word tomorrow. To preserve meat. Not for a day. For a week. For a month. So that the food killed today would feed them 30 days from now. He chose a spot by a rock face. He built a low pit out of stones. He laid poles across the top. He hung thin strips of meat on the poles. At the bottom, he built a smoky fire. Raw branches, green moss. Lots of smoke, little heat. The meat was supposed to dry slowly in the smoke. For hours. For days. until it became hard and dark and suitable for storage. The tribe watched with skepticism. They didn't eat the meat, they hung it over the smoke. Why? Meat must be eaten now, because tomorrow it might be gone, he explained, slowly, using his 70 words. Meat doesn't rot. Meat lasts a long time. Meat waits. They listened to him with expressions that all said the same thing. Madman. Tara was the first to approach. A large, broad-boned woman with 2 children who weren't hers. The very one whose youngest child was sleeping with a swollen belly. She stepped forward and silently began cutting the meat into strips. Thin, even, just as she had cut it her whole life. Only now not to eat, but to hang. He nodded to her. She did not nod back, but she stayed. 2 days later, the smokehouse was in operation. The smell of smoked meat wafted through the cave, spilling out and hanging over the camp like a banner. The smell of food, the smell of the future. He didn't know that this smell would reach the Blackstone's scouts. He didn't know that Say, the chief of the western tribe, was already standing on a hill 3 hours' journey away, sniffing the wind. He didn't know that the smell of smoked meat in the middle of winter was a signal as loud as a shout. It says, "There is something here that you do not have, and someone will come for it." Artem stitched up Silo's wound with boiled water, a bone needle, and sphagnum moss. That night, a scout from the Blackstone's tribe peeked into the cave. Artem set up a system of traps along the western trail and began building a smokehouse. The smell of smoked meat became a signal to the foreign tribe that the Grey River had resources. By the 20th day, the smokehouse had produced its first batch of ready-to-eat meat. Dark, firm, smelling of smoke and resin. He removed the strips from the poles and carried them into the cave. He placed them before Gore. The chief took a piece. He turned it over in his fingers. He sniffed it. He took a bite. He chewed for a long time. His expression changed. First disbelief, then surprise, then something resembling understanding. The meat was tough, salty from the smoke, but it was meat. 20 days after the beast had been killed. Fresh meat, not rotten, not worm-eaten, edible. Gore finished the piece. He looked at him and uttered 2 words. He didn't know the translation, but he understood from the tone. Something like approval, or a command, or both. Tara stood behind him. She was silent, but her face said it all. She had understood before anyone else. If meat could be stored, then there was no need to fear tomorrow. That meant they wouldn't have to go out hunting every day and risk their lives for a single dinner. That meant they could kill a deer today and eat it a month from now. For her, with 2 children to care for, this was more than just convenience. It was life itself. That evening, he sat by the fire and carved a comb out of a bone, a small one, rough, with 5 teeth. The work took 2 hours. He polished it against a flat stone. The prongs were uneven but functional. He walked over to Tara. She was sitting against the wall, feeding the youngest. She still didn't have enough breast milk, but now she was chewing the meat and feeding the baby a paste. He held out the comb to her. She looked at him, at the comb. She took it, ran it through her hair, slowly. The teeth worked their way through the tangled knots, and her hair fell into a single strand. She stopped. She stared at the comb in her hand, for a long time. He waited for her to say thank you, or nod, or smile. She did nothing. She simply turned away toward the wall and continued combing her hair. But he could see her shoulders trembling, quietly, silently. It had been a long time since anyone had done something for her, not something useful, not something necessary for survival, just something beautiful, just for her. On the 22nd day, Urka struck the first blow. Not with his fist, with a word. In the morning, he gathered the tribe around the fire. He spoke at length. His voice was calm and steady, which made it all the more terrifying. He already understood enough words to grasp the gist. The spirits are displeased. A stranger has brought fire that does not come from the spirits. The stranger hunts animals without asking the spirits for permission. The stranger cuts up the meat and hangs it over the smoke, which means he is stealing the spirits' share. The spirits will leave. Without the spirits, the animals will leave. Without the animals, the tribe will die. He listened and understood that the shaman wasn't lying. Urka sincerely believed what he was saying. For him, the spirits were as real as stone, water, and fire. And the stranger who did things without the spirit's blessing was indeed a threat. Not to the shaman, for the universe. Several women nodded. One of the hunters stared gloomily at the floor. Tara held the children and said nothing. Nay stood by the wall with her arms crossed and a stony expression. Bronn stood next to his father. His face betrayed no emotion. Gore listened and remained silent. The chieftain. Old. Wise. He understood both the shaman and the stranger, and that there could be no peace between them. Not in this cave. Not this winter. Urka finished speaking and looked at him. He waited for a response. He stood up. Silently, he walked over to the fire. He pulled a burning twig from the fire. He raised it above his head. The flame flickered in the wind. Then he put the twig back. He took out a bow drill. He crouched down. And before the eyes of the entire tribe, he started a fire. In 40 seconds, the tinder smoldered. A flame rose. He lifted the burning bundle of birch bark and held it out to the shaman, with both hands, like a gift. Urka stared at the fire in his hands for a long time. Then he slowly took it. The old man's hands were trembling, not from fear, from something else. He said in broken language, "Fire. Yours. Spirits. Mine. Together. We live." The shaman said nothing in reply, but he didn't drop the fire. He understood that nothing had been decided, that the shaman would leave and think it over, and that the next blow would be more subtle and more dangerous. But for now, at this very moment, he had bought himself some time. 2 days later, a trap on the western trail was triggered, not by a beast, by a man. A scream echoed through the forest at dawn. The hunters were the first to run. He followed them. A man lay in a pit waist deep. A stake had pierced his leg. Blood. Mud. The man was clad in dark hides, the black stones. A scout. The second one. Maybe the third. They'd been here, constantly, watching, counting, and one of them had been caught. Bronn stood over the pit with his spear, ready to strike, waiting for Gore's order. He stepped closer and looked at the wounded man. Young, no older than 20. His eyes were wild with pain and fear. His leg had been pierced right through. Without help, he would die, from blood loss or infection. He placed his hand on Bronn's shoulder. Bronn flinched. He looked at him. The hunter's eyes were cold and clear. Kill. That was the only question in them. He shook his head. No. Bronn bared his teeth. He didn't understand, or he didn't agree. He turned to Gore. The old chieftain stood slightly behind him. He looked at the wounded man, then at him. He spoke in the tribe's language, slowly, choosing his words carefully. Alive. Back. To his own people. He'll tell us. We're strong. We're not afraid. Gore listened. He was silent. He thought. Then he nodded, briefly, once. Bronn exhaled through clenched teeth. He put away his spear. He stepped back. He climbed down into the pit. He pulled the stake out of his leg. The wounded man screamed. He rinsed the wound with water from the stream, bandaged it with moss and hide, helped him climb out. The stranger stood on one leg and looked at him, not at Bronn with the spear, not at Gore, at him, trying to understand. He pointed west. Go, back to your people. Say it. We're here. We're waiting. The stranger hobbled away, slowly, dragging his leg, leaving a trail of blood in the snow. Bronn watched him go. Then he turned and said something short and angry. He didn't understand the words, but he understood the meaning. You let the enemy go. You're a fool. Maybe, but a fool with a plan. That evening, he sat in a corner of the cave and drew, with charcoal on a piece of light-colored leather. He drew a map of the valley, streams, trails, the forest, caves, hills. He marked where the Blackstone's tracks had been, where the scouts had come from, where they had gone. He drew and thought. Karsay will get his wounded man back. He'll see the bandage. He'll see that his man wasn't killed but was healed and set free. This is a message, not of weakness, of strength. We could have killed him, but we didn't. That means we have a choice. That means we're open to dialogue. Or it means we're foolish and should be attacked while we're still being kind. He didn't know what conclusion Karsay would draw, but he knew that a dead scout meant immediate war. A living scout, however, was a question. And a question is always better than an answer you can't avoid. Nay came over and sat down beside him. She looked at the map. For a long time. She traced the lines with her finger. He pointed things out. This is a stream. This is a trail. This is a cave. We're here. They're here. She listened. She nodded. Then she poked her finger at a spot on the map he hadn't marked. She said a word. He didn't know it. She repeated it. She gestured with her hands. Something big. Lots of water. A lake. She was pointing to a lake to the south, far away, beyond the forest. There are people there, others. Not the Black Stones. A small tribe, not dangerous. He drew the lake. He put a dot there. Nay nodded. He remembered. There's someone else to the south, not an enemy. Maybe an ally. Maybe a trading partner. Maybe the future. That night he didn't sleep. He lay on the hide and listened to the breathing of 30 people. The children's coughing grew quieter. It hadn't gone away, but it had quieted down. The food was doing its job. Their bodies were beginning to fight back. Silo tossed and turned in his sleep, but his wound was healing. The stitch was holding. The moss was working. In a week, the boy would be walking. In 2 weeks, working. He lay there and thought about what he had done in 24 days. Loops. Fire. The atlatl. The smokehouse. The stitched-up wound. The map. Traps on the trail. The enemy set free. In 24 days, he hadn't built a civilization. He hadn't created anything great. He'd simply shown 30 people that tomorrow exists, that it's possible to plan, that it's possible to preserve, that it's possible not to kill someone who can be healed. And it was so little and so much at the same time that it took his breath away. He closed his eyes and thought, safety protocols have been completely violated. The production meeting is postponed until tomorrow. Good night, colleagues. And for the first time in 24 days, he smiled. Shaman Urka openly spoke out against Artem, accusing him of inciting the wrath of the spirits. Artem responded with a symbolic gesture, passing the fire to the shaman and offering coexistence. A Blackstone scout fell into a trap on the trail. A Blackstone's scout. Artem insisted that he be treated and released. Nay pointed out the southern lake on the map, where a small, peaceful tribe lives. On the 26th day, he woke up to the realization that not a single child was coughing. Silence. A strange, unfamiliar silence broken only by the crackling of the campfire and the breathing of sleeping people. He lay there listening and couldn't believe it. The 3 children who had been choking on coughs every night were silent, not because they had died, it was because they had begun to recover. Food, warmth, hot water. The willow bark he'd found by the stream on the 20th day and brewed every evening. A bitter decoction that made the children grimace and spit it out, but which brought down their fever. Their bodies fought, and their bodies won. For the first time that winter, death took a step back. But something else took its place. Tara's little girl, that very one, with a swollen belly and thin legs. She wasn't coughing. She had a fever, a high one. Her forehead was so hot that his hand jerked away. Her eyes were cloudy. Her breathing was rapid and shallow. Tara sat beside her, holding her hand, and Tara's face had the look of someone who already knew how it would all end. The tribe knew it too. Children like this didn't survive. In winter, in a cave, without medicine. They mourned such children in advance, and quietly prepared for the fact that by morning there would be one less skin. He walked over to Tara, sat down beside her, looked at the girl, touched her forehead. It was hot, very hot. Her pulse was rapid, her breathing was labored. Perhaps pneumonia, perhaps something else. He wasn't a doctor. He couldn't make a diagnosis, but he knew what to do about the fever, and he knew what not to do. Don't bundle her up. Don't leave her without water. Don't wait for the spirits to take her or bring her back. Take action. He built a second fire, a small one, next to the girl. He placed a leather water bag there. He threw hot stones into the water. The water boiled. He brewed willow bark tea, a lot of it, strong. He let it cool until it was warm. Then he began to give the girl the tea, a sip at a time. She didn't want to drink. She turned her head away. He held her head and brought the tea to her lips, drop by drop, sip by sip. Tara watched and said nothing. Then he took some moss. He soaked it in cold water from the stream. He placed it on the girl's forehead. She flinched from the cold. He held the moss. He changed it every few minutes. He soaked it again. He applied it again. The shaman watched from his corner. He didn't approach. He didn't interfere. But he didn't help either. The shaman's young daughter stood between them, between her father and the stranger. He saw her out of the corner of his eye. She shifted from foot to foot. Then she took a step toward him, not toward her father. She approached and sat down beside him. Silently, she took the moss from his hands, dipped it in the water, and placed it on the girl's neck. He nodded. She understood without words. Then he made an inhaler. A crude one, a ridiculous one. He rolled a piece of hide into a tube. He directed one end toward the girl's face, the other toward the bag of boiling water. Steam flowed through the tube, and the girl breathed in the hot, moist air. Her wheezing grew softer. Her breathing was slightly more even. He sat by the girl's side all night. Uni sat nearby. She changed the moss. She added water. She tossed twigs onto the fire. Not once did she ask why. Not once did she look at her father. By dawn, the fever began to subside. Slowly, like receding water. Her forehead grew slightly cooler. Her breathing deepened. The girl opened her eyes. Cloudy, but alive. And she asked for food. One word. Quiet. Hoarse. Food. Tara heard that word and stood up. She stepped out of the cave, into the snow. She dropped to her knees, facing east, toward the sunrise. And she stood that way until the sun had fully risen. No one approached her. Everyone stood nearby, in silence. And in that silence was something he had never felt in his world. Not gratitude, not surprise. Acknowledgement. Acknowledgement that the child was alive, that winter hadn't taken him, that someone had sat by the little fur all night and kept death from entering. Uni stood beside him, small, slender, with dark circles under her eyes from a sleepless night. She looked at him and said a word. He knew that word. All right. He nodded. All right? Then he turned and saw Urka. The shaman stood at the entrance to the cave. He was looking at his daughter, at the stranger standing beside her, at the people standing in silence, at Tara kneeling before the sunrise. And there was something on his face that he couldn't read. Not anger, not fear, bitterness. The shaman understood. His world was ending, not because the stranger was evil, but because the stranger was right. Willow bark worked better than the drum. And that was the most terrifying thing a man who had devoted his entire life to the drum could see. In the days that followed, he built a corner for Tara. He partitioned off part of the cave with a hide stretched over poles. The first wall. The first room. A place where a woman with 2 children could sleep, not among 30 bodies, but behind a partition. In warmth. In silence. In something resembling privacy. Tara stood before that hide, touching it, unable to understand why. Why a wall inside the cave? Why separate herself from the others? Then she went inside. She sat both children down on the hide. The younger one fell asleep right away. The girl, the very one whose fever he'd been trying to bring down all night, sat there looking around. At the poles, at the hide wall, at the fire that was seeping through the cracks. Then she lay down and fell asleep too. Tara came out. She walked over to him. She stood beside him. She said softly, "If you'd wanted me to, I would have come. But you won't want me to, because you're kind." He looked at her. Strong, broad-boned, with hands that could do anything, with a face that had long forgotten what it meant to be a woman rather than a workhorse. He didn't answer, because he didn't know what to say. Because in this world, words carried a weight he didn't yet understand. She nodded, as if his silence were the answer. She turned and walked away behind her hide wall, to her children. On the 30th day, the envoy arrived, alone, unarmed, with a bundle of dry grass held aloft in his raised hand, a sign of peace, or a sign of negotiation. The man was large, over 30, with a beard braided into 3 plaits and a scar running across his entire face from temple to chin. He entered the camp slowly. He stopped 10 paces from the cave entrance and waited. Gore went out to meet him, Braun behind him, Nay on the right with a spear. He stood slightly behind and listened. The envoy spoke, at length, calmly. His voice was low and resonant. He didn't understand everything but enough. Se, chieftain of the Blackstones, proposed sharing. Luck, food, fire. Those who have much must give to those who have little. It had always been that way. So say the spirits. That would be the right thing to do. He listened and translated it for himself. To share means to give away. To give away means to grow weak. To grow weak means to become prey. Se didn't want to be friends. He wanted to try the easy way out. To take it without a fight. Gore was silent. He thought. He looked at him. He stepped closer. He spoke in the tribe's language, slowly and clearly.
We'll give you meat.
Smoked. Plenty, but not a secret. Not fire. Not a person. The ambassador looked at him, for the first time, scrutinizingly. Then he asked something. Who is this? Gore replied briefly. The one who tamed fire. The ambassador was silent. He watched. He memorized the face. Then he nodded, turned around, and left. Empty-handed. Without meat. Without an answer. Only with the stranger's face in his memory. That evening, Nay approached him by the campfire. She said one sentence. He'll come again. Not alone. He nodded. I know. Artem spent the whole night fighting for the life of Tara's daughter, using willow bark, hot steam, and cold moss. The girl survived. Uni, the shaman's daughter, helped him openly for the first time, defying her father's authority. Artem built a separate corner for Tara in the cave. An envoy from the Blackstones arrived, demanding a share. Artem offered to give them smoked meat but refused to hand over his knowledge or his people. On the 35th day, he began building a workshop, a corner of the cave by the far wall. Dry, with a smooth stone floor. He cleared the space. He hauled in flat stones for his work. He laid out his tools, scrapers, chisels, flint flakes, bone needles, strands of tendons, pieces of leather, birch bark, resin in clay lumps. Everything he had gathered bit by bit over 5 weeks. All in one place. For the first time in the history of this tribe, things were not lying where they had fallen, but where they had been placed on purpose. Tuk was the first apprentice. He came every morning, sat down nearby, and waited. He didn't ask questions. He just waited. His hands were scratched and rough, but they moved with precision. He showed him how to make arrowheads. Not the rough-hewn pieces of flint they used for hunting here, but real ones. Double-sided, with a cutting edge and a shaft socket for tying. Strike after strike, flake after flake, stone against stone. Tuk broke the first 10 blanks. On the 11th, he succeeded. The arrowhead was rough and crooked, but it was an arrowhead. With a blade, with a shape, with a purpose. Tuk held it up to the light and gazed at it like a child looking at the first fish he'd ever caught. Silo returned to his work. His leg had healed. The stitches had dissolved. The scar remained. A long stretch of scar from his knee to the middle of his calf. The first scar in the history of this world that came not from a beast, but from medical treatment. Silo walked with a slight limp, but he walked. And the first thing he did when he returned was to come to the workshop. He sat down next to Tuk, and he began to learn. He was different from Tuk. Tuk was all hands. Silo was all head. Tuk did. Silo asked, "Why this stone and not that one? Why strike from the side and not from above? Why pine resin and not spruce resin?" Questions in a language of which he now knew 150 words. Questions to which he answered slowly, choosing each word as carefully as a stone for a masonry wall. On the 38th day, Li Na came to him at night. Not exactly. She approached the campfire where he was sitting and drawing a map. Quiet. Small. Almost invisible. She had always been almost invisible. 19 years old. Large, dark eyes that held a constant question. She was considered strange, not of this world. No one had asked for her hand in marriage because they were afraid of her. She had dreams. He knew this because he'd heard the women whispering about her. She sat down beside him. She was silent for a long time. Then she began to speak. Quietly. Quickly. As if she were afraid that if she stopped, she wouldn't be able to start again. She spoke of dreams. He didn't understand everything, but he understood enough. Straight roads. As straight as an arrow. As solid as stone. Shining carriages that moved on their own, without reindeer or horses. Lights in the windows of tall buildings. As tall as cliffs. Those trees. Lights that never go out. Not from a campfire. Different. Steady. Unflickering. He stopped drawing. He sat and listened. And with every word she spoke, the world around him grew stranger. Not a cave. Not the Paleolithic era. Leonard's dreams. She was describing a city. A modern city. Roads, cars, skyscrapers, electric light. She was describing the world he had come from. She had never been there. She was born here, in a cave by the campfire. But she had seen that world in her dreams. Every night. Ever since childhood. She thought they were spirits. That the spirits were showing her the land of the dead. Or the land of the unborn. Her grandmother had had the same dreams. And she died young because the tribe decided she was possessed. Lina was afraid. Afraid to speak. Afraid to stay silent. Afraid that the same thing would happen to her as had happened to her grandmother. He listened and thought. His transport wasn't a coincidence. Lina's dreams weren't madness. Something connected these two worlds. Something transported people or images or fragments of reality from one time to another. Something had left a six-fingered handprint on the wall of the burial cave. Someone had already been here before him. He looked at Lina. She sat curled up in a ball waiting for his reaction. Waiting for him to say the same thing everyone else had said. That she was sick. That the spirits were laughing at her. That she needed to be quiet and not scare people. He said, "Yes, this happens. It's not madness." 3 sentences. Simple. In a language where she understood every word. She looked at him. Her eyes were wet. Her lips were pressed together. Her hands were clenched into fists. Then she began to cry. Quietly. Soundlessly. Like someone who had been holding something heavy inside for many years and had finally let it go. He didn't hug her. He didn't pat her on the head. He did something else. He stood up. Went to the workshop. Took a flat stone. Carved a hollow in it. He poured fat into the hollow. He twisted a wick from dry moss. He placed it in the fat. He lit it. A lamp. Small, dim, but steady. Not flickering like a campfire. Calm. Constant. He brought the lamp and placed it in front of Lina. The light fell on her face. Even light. Calm. Not dancing. She took the lamp in her hands. Raised it to her eyes. Looked at the flame. This is what the lights in her dreams looked like. Steady. Unfading. Quiet. She held the lamp and cried and laughed at the same time. And it was the strangest and most beautiful thing he had ever seen in this world. He said, "This is for you, to think about at night." She pressed the lamp to her chest like a child. The next day, Urka summoned him for a talk. Not in front of everyone, privately, at the cave entrance at dawn. The shaman stood and looked east, at the forest, at the snow, at the world he'd known all his life and that was changing before his very eyes. He spoke, slowly, as one speaks to an equal, not to a stranger, to an equal. He understood almost everything. "You're teaching my daughter. You gave her the lamp. You say spirits aren't necessary." He replied, "No, not like that. Spirits are necessary, but medicine is necessary too. Your daughter can do both." Urka was silent for a long time. Then he said, "You'll take everything from me." He shook his head. "No, I'll give you something else." The shaman smiled, bitterly, like a man who hears a promise and doesn't believe it but wants to believe it. Then he left, without a word, without a threat, but without peace either. On the 40th day, he made something for Nay. Not a weapon, not a tool. Moccasins. He'd noticed she was limping. Her left leg. Not an injury, not a wound. Something old. Maybe a dislocation that had healed improperly. Maybe just wear and tear from endless walking barefoot on rock and snow. She never complained. She never complained about anything at all. But he could see it. In the mornings, she stepped on her left foot carefully. By evening, the limp was more noticeable. He made moccasins out of soft deer hide, double-soled, with moss between the layers for warmth and softness, stitched with sinew, with laces at the ankle, tailored to her foot, made just for her. He measured the length of her foot from the imprint on a wet rock, adjusted the width, thought through every stitch. 3 evenings of work. He set them down in front of her that morning, just placed them next to her hide, without a word. She woke up, saw them, picked them up, turned them over in her hands, tried one on, then the other. Stood up. She walked a few steps. 3 steps. 4. 5. She stopped, with her back to him. She stood there for a long time. Then she turned around. There were no tears on her face, no smile. There was something else. Something for which there was no word in his language, but there was in hers. She said that word, quietly. One word. He didn't know it, but he remembered it. Artem set up a workshop and began teaching Tuka and Silo. Lena told him about her dreams of the modern world, and he confirmed that she wasn't crazy. He made her an oil lamp for her. The shaman Urka spoke with him in private, expressing his fear of losing his place. Artem made Nay some moccasins to fit her foot, noticing that she was limping. The second month ended, and the cave smelled different. Not of death, not of rot. Smoke and fat and pine resin, and something warm that was hard to name but easy to recognize. Life. The snares yielded 2 or 3 animals a day. The smokehouse ran non-stop. Strips of meat hung on poles, dark and dry, and their scent hung over the camp like a promise. A canopy of poles and hides appeared at the cave entrance. Firewood was stored under the canopy, dry, prepared in advance. For the first time in these people's lives, they didn't have to search for firewood every day in a panic, but simply took it from the pile, as if the forest itself had brought it and stacked it there. But it was precisely during those days, when it seemed things couldn't get any worse, that the shaman struck a second blow. Subtler than the first, more cunning, more terrifying. Urka did not cry out about the wrath of the spirits. He did not demand the expulsion of the stranger. He did what he did best. He sowed doubt. One of the women of Nayla fell ill. Her stomach, sharp pain, vomiting. He looked at her and couldn't tell what it was. Maybe food poisoning. Maybe an infection. Maybe kidney stones. He didn't know. He wasn't a doctor. He gave her willow bark and hot water and told her to lie down. That was all he could do. Urka came to Nayla that night. He sat by her skin. He sang. He beat a drum. He burned dry grasses. He did what he'd done all his life. And by morning, Nayla was feeling better. The pain was gone. The vomiting had stopped. She got up, went to the fire, ate, and smiled. Urka didn't say a word. He didn't need to. The tribe saw. The stranger couldn't. The shaman could. The stranger provided bark and water. The shaman provided the drum and spirits. Who did it help? The shaman. He understood what had happened. Nayla had most likely overeaten after weeks of starvation. Her stomach couldn't handle it. The pain went away on its own. The drum had nothing to do with it. But in a world without microscopes or x-rays, a concept that didn't exist had nothing to do with it. Here, cause and effect in their simplest form. The shaman sang. The woman recovered. Therefore the shaman healed her. Logical, irrefutable, deadly accurate. The next day, 4 people stopped coming to him. 2 women, 1 hunter, and 1 teenager. Not openly, not hostile. They simply stopped. They didn't gather around the fire. They didn't come to the workshop. They didn't ask. They averted their eyes. A whisper spread through the cave, quiet and poisonous like smoke from damp branches. The stranger angers the spirits. Maybe that's why Nayla got sick. Maybe that's why winter is so long. Maybe if the stranger leaves, the spirits will return and everything will be as it was before. He sat in the workshop and thought. He could have argued. He could have proven his point. He could have shown that bark, water, and purity worked better than a drum. But he knew. Evidence does not defeat belief. It never has. Neither in his world nor in this one. Faith can only be overcome by another faith, or by time. He had no time, nor did he have faith. There was only Uni, the shaman's daughter, 16 years old, bold, curious, the only young person who kept coming to the workshop every day despite her father. He called her over, sat down beside her. He showed her some willow bark. He said, "This is medicine for when your head hurts, when you have a fever, when your bones ache. Drink the decoction. It's bitter. It tastes bad, but it helps." She took the bark. She sniffed it. She took a bite. She grimaced. He showed her sphagnum moss. He said, "This is for wounds. It's clean. It stops the pus. Put it on a cut. Tie it down. Change it every day." She listened. She memorized it. He saw how her eyes moved, quickly, sharply. She wasn't just memorizing. She was understanding, making connections. The bark reduces fever. The moss cleans the wound. Hot water kills what's causing the wound to fester. 3 things. 3 simple things. But together they formed a system, and Uni saw that system. He wasn't teaching her to be a doctor. He was teaching her not to be a shaman, not to believe that illness is the wrath of the spirits, to believe that illness is the body fighting back and that it can be helped. The body, not the soul, the body. On the 45th day, Braun came to him with a request. For the first time, without his father's order, without witnesses. In the morning by the stream, Braun stood there in silence for a long time. Then he said, "My father is growing weak. Show me how you throw. Not a spear, a word." He didn't understand at first. Then he did. Braun had seen how he spoke to people, how he explained things, how he persuaded them, how he steered the conversation in the right direction. Braun was a hunter, strong, fast, accurate, but he didn't know how to speak. In his world, the chief spoke and the rest listened. Now the chief was growing weak, and Braun was set to become the chief.
And he understood that you don't become a chief with a spear or an atlatl.
He looked at Braun. 24 years old, young, passionate, accustomed to being the best. Accustomed to solving problems with his fists and a spear. And yet he had come to him, to the stranger he hated, with a request. It was the hardest thing Braun had ever done in his life. He nodded. They stood by the stream and he taught Braun how to speak. Not words. Braun already knew words. He taught him how to listen, stand still, be quiet, look at the person, look him in the eyes. Don't interrupt. When he's finished, wait. Then speak. Few words, just the essentials. Braun listened. His face was tense. Every word came harder to him than throwing a spear 60 paces. But he listened, and he remembered. And at that moment, he ceased to be an enemy. He became a student. An awkward one. A stubborn one. A proud one. But a student nonetheless. By the 50th day, the tribe had changed. Not on the outside, on the inside. People began to do things they had never done before. They began to plan. In the morning, the hunters discussed where to go. They didn't just set off, they discussed it. The women divided up the work.
Who would fetch water? Who would tend the smokehouse? Who would prepare the hides?
The children, the little, dirty, perpetually hungry children, began to tidy things up. Not because they were forced to, but because they saw how he gathered things. Every stone in its place. Every tool in the workshop. Every bone in the pile for work. Order. Not military order, human order. Tuk ran around the camp, solemnly uttering a word he'd picked up from him. A strange word in a foreign language that he'd say whenever something fell or went wrong. Tuk pronounced it earnestly and incorrectly, and it looked so comical that even Urka once smiled. A little boy, 6 years old, whose name he hadn't yet remembered. He ran up to him one afternoon and held out a stone, an ordinary stone, round, gray, nothing special. But the boy held it out with both hands and said, "For you!" He took the stone, looked at the boy. The boy ran away. He held the stone in his hand and realized that this was the first gift. Not a thank you for meat or fire or medicine. Just a gift. Just because. And that stone was worth more than all the atlatls and smokehouses in the world.
The shaman Urka dealt a subtle blow by healing the woman Nayla with his drum and undermining Artem's authority.
Part of the tribe began to shun the stranger. Artem began teaching Uni the basics of herbal medicine and bandaging. Braun came to him on his own for the first time with a request to teach him to speak like a chief. The tribe began to spontaneously adopt habits of order and planning. The 3rd month began with a thaw. The snow hadn't melted, but it had settled and grown heavier, and a scent appeared in the air that hadn't been there since fall. Earth. Wet earth beneath the snow. Spring was still far off, but it had sent its first signal. And that signal meant one thing. Time. He now had time. But along with time came Karsei. Not in person, not right away. First, 2 came. 2 warriors of the Black Stones. Without the grass of peace in their hands. With spears. They appeared on the western trail in the morning and stood 100 paces from the camp. They didn't approach. They didn't shout. They just stood and watched. For 2 hours. Then they left. The next day 4 came. They stood closer. 80 paces. They stood there until noon. Then they left. On the 3rd day, 6 came. 60 paces. They stood there until evening. He understood what was happening. Pressure. Not an attack. Pressure. Karsay was showing that he could come whenever he wanted, as many people as he wanted, and stand as close as he wanted. Gore convened a council. 6 hunters. Nay, Braun, Urka, and him. His first time at a tribal council. Gore sat in the center. He spoke quietly. He understood almost everything. The chief asked, "What do we do?" Braun spoke first. "We fight. We go out and fight. We have atlatls. They won't be expecting us. We'll strike first." Nay shook her head. "There are more of them. They have 20 warriors. We have 6. The atlatls won't help if they all come at us at once." Urka was silent. He stared into the fire, lost in his own thoughts. He asked to speak. Gore nodded. He spoke slowly, using the 200 words he knew, choosing each one carefully. "Don't fight. Don't run. Show them. Show them that we're ready. Show that we're stronger than we seem. Show that taking us will be costly, costlier than making a deal." He laid out a plan. A simple one. At a level these people could grasp. Traps on all the trails. Not just the western one. Patrols. 2 lookouts on the hill, day and night. Torches. Lots of torches. Around the perimeter of the camp. At night they'll burn. And from a distance, it'll look like there are 3 times as many people in the camp as there actually are. And smoked meat. Lots of smoked meat. Hang it out in the open. Let them see it. Let them smell it. Let them realize we have so much food that we can afford to show it off. It's a bluff. A pure bluff. They had enough meat for 2 weeks. Not a month. Not a year. 2 weeks. But Karsay didn't know that. He saw the smoke from the smokehouse. He saw their well-fed faces. He saw the torches. And he had to decide whether it was worth meddling where life was so good. Gore listened. He said nothing. Then he looked at Braun. Braun was gripping his spear so tightly his fingers had turned white. But he nodded. Once. Briefly. Just like last time. Just like every time when the stranger's plan seemed insane to him, but there was no better option. They worked for 3 days. They dug, they set snares, they strung wires, they drove stakes into the ground. He worked alongside everyone else. His hands were torn and bleeding. His fingernails were broken. His fingers wouldn't bend from the cold. But he dug and hauled rocks and dragged poles. And by the evening of the 3rd day, the camp looked different. Torches stood 30 paces around the cave. 12 of them. Poles wrapped in birch bark and soaked in fat. At night they burned, and their light could be seen from far away. On the trails from the west and north were traps, pits, tripstones, falling logs. Smoked meat hung in plain sight, on poles in front of the cave entrance, out in the open, ostentatiously. There it is. Look, we're not hiding anything. We have enough. On the 4th day, Karsay arrived. In person. He was exactly as he had imagined himself. Large, heavy, with a face carved from stone, small, intelligent eyes, huge hands. He had more scars than hair. He came with 10 warriors. He stopped 50 paces away and waited. Gore went out to meet him, slowly, with a dignity that had nothing to do with strength or age. Braun on the right, Nay on the left. He stood slightly behind them. The chieftain spoke, at length. He listened and understood. Karsay didn't shout. He didn't threaten. He spoke evenly and calmly, like a man who possesses strength and knows that strength is on his side. He was making an offer, not a request. An offer. Give us the one who makes these things, or show us how to make them, or we'll come and take them ourselves. 3 options. All 3 were equally bad for the Grey River tribe. Gore was silent. He stepped forward. Karsay looked at him. For the first time. The Blackstone's chief's eyes were like 2 dark stones at the bottom of a stream. Cold. Clear. All-seeing. He spoke. In a language that, over the past 2 months, had almost become his own. Slowly. Clearly. We do not hand over people. We do not hand over fire. We give meat. Smoked meat. As much as we can. Every moon. Meat for peace. Karsay listened. He was silent. Then he said, "The meat will run out. The man who makes the meat will not." A clever thought. Cruel. Right by the standards of a world where all that matters is tomorrow. He replied, "If you take me, I won't work. If you kill me, my knowledge will die with me. But if we make a deal, you'll get meat every moon, and spearheads, and moccasins, and traps for your hunters. That's all. No war." Karsay looked at him. For a long time, then he smirked, with one side of his mouth, like a man who had seen something in another that he hadn't expected. Then he turned to his people. He said something, briefly. The warriors turned and walked away. Karsay was the last to leave. He stopped, turned around, and said, "1 moon. I'll be back in a moon. And there will be more meat, or the conversation will be different." He left. Silence. Gore stood and watched him go. Braun stood nearby, breathing heavily as if he'd just finished a run. Nay slowly lowered the spear she'd been holding all this time. He sat down right in the snow. His legs wouldn't hold him. His hands were shaking. The adrenaline was fading, leaving a void in its wake. 1 moon. 30 days. In 30 days, he had to produce enough smoked meat, spearheads, and moccasins to convince Karsay that trading was more profitable than fighting. 30 days until the next conversation. Or until war. He lay on his back in the snow, staring at the gray sky and thinking. A plan. He needed a plan. Not for a day. For a month. Hunting. Traps. The smokehouse. The workshop. Arrowheads. Moccasins. Training. All at once. Everyone. Every pair of hands. Every day. He sat up. He looked at the cave. At the people standing there, waiting. Waiting for him to speak. For the first time, they weren't waiting for Gore, not Brona, him. He stood up, brushed off the snow, and said, "Let's get to work." The Blackstones began to apply pressure, sending warriors closer and closer to the camp. Artem organized a defense with torches, traps, and a display of supplies. Karsay came in person and demanded that they hand over Artem or their knowledge. Artem proposed a trade of meat, arrowheads, and moccasins. Karsay gave them 1 month to prepare the first shipment. 30 days. He broke them down into parts. The first 10 days, hunting and gathering. The second 10 days, workshop and production. The last 10 days, packing and preparing for the meeting. He explained the plan to Gore. The chieftain listened. He nodded. He didn't object. Something inside the old man had broken after Karsay's visit. Not his body, his spirit. Gore was a chieftain of the old world, a world where strength decided everything, a world where outsiders were either killed or accepted, but never listened to, a world where trading with the enemy was a disgrace. That world was coming to an end, and Gore knew it. And that knowledge weighed on his shoulders heavier than any stone. Braun accepted the plan in silence. No arguments, no fists. He took his atlatl and set out with the hunters at dawn, and by noon they had dragged back a young deer. Whole. Heavy. With antlers tangled with branches. Braun threw his spear 60 paces and struck it in the neck. Clean. The beast fell and did not get up. 3 months ago, such a throw would have been impossible. 3 months ago, the hunters roamed in a pack with short spears, hoping for luck. Now Braun was a machine. Precise. Deadly. And this machine operated on a stick with a hook made by a stranger. The women cut up the meat. Tara stood by the smokehouse and directed the work. Without words. With gestures. With her gaze. She knew the business better than anyone. In 2 months, she had become the mistress of the smokehouse, just as she was the mistress of her family. Firmly. Precisely. Without sentiment. The meat hung in even rows, and smoke swirled around it in a thick cloud, and Tara watched over every strip like a mother watches over her children. He worked in the workshop, from morning until dark. Arrowheads, one after another. Talk was nearby. Silo was nearby. Uni came by after lunch. She didn't make arrowheads. She prepared medicines. She dried willow bark. She gathered moss. She brewed decoctions. She sorted through the herb supplies. He taught her every day. A new plant, a new property, a new rule. Don't eat this. Don't drink that. Brew this bark and apply that one. She remembered everything, every word, every gesture. And he saw something in her that he didn't see in others. Not just a student. The future. If he died tomorrow, Uni would carry on. Uni would heal. Uni would know. And the knowledge would not die with him. On the 5th day of the 10-day period, Seon-hee came to see him. He knew her by name but hardly ever spoke to her. An outsider. a captive from a southern tribe. 3 winters in captivity. She spoke with an accent, kept to herself, thin, wiry, with eyes that held the constant wariness of a hunted animal. She came and sat down beside him, in silence. He waited. She spoke. Slowly, laboriously choosing her words in a language that was as foreign to her as it was to him. She spoke of the South, of her tribe, of the lake, about a child, a boy, 4 years old when they took her away. Now he's 7, if he's alive. She didn't know if he was alive, didn't know if he remembered her face, didn't know if anyone had found him after they dragged her away. 3 winters without a word. 3 winters with a hole inside that nothing could fill. He listened. He didn't interrupt. He didn't make any promises. He just listened. When she finished, he said, "I can't bring your son back to you right now, but I can send a message. When a path south opens up, I'll send it." She looked at him. Tears welled up in her eyes, but she wouldn't let them fall. 3 winters. Then she said his name. Artem. Not a nickname, not a title, a name. And when it passed her lips, it sounded as it had never sounded before, like the most tender and the heaviest word at the same time. On the 10th day, he took inventory of their supplies. Smoked meat, 40 strips. Enough for a gift for Karsi and a week's worth for his own people. Arrowheads, 12 of them. Took made 5 himself. Moccasins, 3 pairs. Rough but sturdy. Salt. He found a salt flat 4 hours' journey to the south. Nay showed him the spot. The salt was dirty, mixed with clay and sand, but it was salt. In a world where salt was more valuable than meat, it was gold. He gathered as much salt as he could carry, brought it back to camp. He dissolved it in water. He filtered it through moss and thin leather. He evaporated it on flat stones by the campfire. He ended up with white crystals, pure, bitter to the taste from the impurities but undoubtedly salt. The tribe regarded the white crystals as a treasure. Tara took a pinch and placed it on her tongue. She closed her eyes. She stood like that for a few seconds. Then she opened her eyes and looked at him. And he realized that at that moment, she had made a decision. He would find out exactly what it was later, but she had made it. Nay walked with him to the salt flats, in silence, side by side. 4 hours one way, 4 back. 8 hours side by side. They didn't talk, almost not at all. Sometimes she pointed at something, footprints, a tree, a rock. She'd name them, he'd repeat them. She'd correct him, he'd repeat them again. On the way back, heavily laden with a sack of salt, he tripped over a root and fell face first into the snow. The sack struck his back. He lay in a snowdrift and felt the salt pouring down his collar. Nay stood over him. She watched. And for the first time in his presence, she laughed. Briefly, sharply, like a bark. But it was laughter. Her first laugh in 2 years. Ever since the bear had killed her husband. He got to his feet. He brushed himself off. He looked at her. She wasn't laughing anymore. Her face was stony again. But her eyes, there was still something alive in them. Something had been hiding for 2 years and peeked out for a second, like a little animal from its burrow. On the 20th day, the workshop was running 3 shifts. In the morning, Took and Silo made arrowheads. In the afternoon, he himself made tools, scrapers, knives, and awls. In the evening, Uni dried and sorted the medicines. He carved a bone knife for Nay. Not just any knife, a knife tailored to her hand. He measured the length of her palm, the width of her grip, the weight she was used to holding. And he carved the handle from deer antler to fit her fingers exactly. The blade was made of flint, thin, sharp, with fine retouching along the edge. He tied it with sinew, coated it with resin, and polished the handle against leather. 3 evenings of work. He placed the knife before her just as he had placed the moccasins, in the morning on her hide, without words. She picked up the knife, turned it over in her hands, checked the grip, checked the balance, ran the blade along her fingernail. The knife was sharp, sharper than any knife she had ever held in her life. She looked at the handle, at the spot where the wood fit perfectly in her palm, at every curve tailored to her fingers. She understood. He had made this knife for her, not for the tribe, not for hunting at all, for her, to fit her hand. She looked up. She looked at him. For a long time. Then she said a word. That very one. The one she'd said when he'd given her the moccasins. The word he didn't know. He asked Took that evening what the word meant. Took looked at him strangely. Then he said, "It's an old word. Women say it when they find their one. My one. Not a thing. A person. My person." He sat by the fire and said nothing. And he thought about the woman with the stony face and eyes in which life was hidden, and about the word that meant more than a husband, and more than a friend, and more than everything he knew about love in his former world. On the 25th day, he gathered everything: meat, arrowheads, moccasins, salt. He laid it out on a hide in front of the cave. He looked at it. It was a lot for a tribe that had been starving to death just 2 months ago, and a pitifully small amount to buy peace. But it was all he had, and he had to make it last. He looked west, toward where, beyond the forest and the hills, Karsay lived with his tribe. He would arrive in 5 days, and everything depended on how this meeting went: the lives of 30 people, the future he was trying to build, and his own fate in a world where he was a guest who hadn't yet been killed. Artem organized 30 days of preparation for the meeting with Karsay, dividing the work into hunting, production, and preparations. Senhi told him about her son left behind in the south, and he promised to pass on the message at the first opportunity. He found a salt flat and learned how to purify salt. Artem made Nai a bone knife that fit her hand, and learned that she called him by a word meaning, "my man." On the 30th day, Karsay arrived with 20 warriors, not 10 as last time, but 20. They emerged from the forest at dawn, and formed a semicircle on the western clearing, spears in their hands. Their faces smeared with black clay. Silent, heavy, like stones on the edge of a cliff. He stood at the cave entrance and counted. 20 warriors. He had 6 hunters. Nay, brawn. 4 with spears. 2 teenagers with slings he'd gathered over the past week. Traps on the trails, torches, and a sack of salt, smoked meat, arrowheads, and moccasins at his feet. Gore stepped out first, just like last time, with dignity, a staff in his hand. Slowly. Brawn behind him. Nay, him. Karsay stood in the center of his semicircle and waited. His face was like stone, his eyes like water beneath the ice. He didn't greet them, didn't nod. He waited. Gore stopped 20 paces away. He looked at Karsay. Then he turned toward him, and did what no one expected. He stepped back. 1 step. He yielded the space. To him. He stood there and felt 30 pairs of eyes watching him. 6 of his own, 20 of others. 4 behind him, 30. And every pair was waiting for him to speak. He stepped forward, set the bag down on the snow, untied it, took out the smoked meat, laid it out on the hide. Strip by strip, 40 pieces. Then the arrowheads, 12. Dark, sharp, with inlays. Then the moccasins, 3 pairs. Then the salt. White crystals on a piece of hide. Karsay watched. He saw how his eyes moved. From the meat to the arrowheads. From the arrowheads to the moccasins. From the moccasins to the salt. His eyes stopped on the salt. Karsay stepped forward. He bent down, took a pinch, put it on his tongue, closed his eyes, opened them. Something had changed in them. Not greed, understanding. He realized that what lay before him was no mere stroke of luck. Before him was a system. Traps catch the beast. The smokehouse preserves the meat. The salt marsh provides salt. The workshop makes tools. Everything is connected. Everything works. And all of this comes from the mind of a single man. Karsay straightened up. He looked at him. And he spoke. Not to Gore, to him. His voice was quiet and steady. He understood every word. You will break everything. You will break the spirits. You will break fear. Without fear, a person is not a person. He was silent. He thought. Then he replied, I know. I'll break it anyway. Karsay looked at him. For a long time, the way one looks at a fire that can no longer be extinguished. Then he smiled. That same smile, with one side of his mouth. He bent down. He took 3 strips of meat from the hide, 4 arrowheads, 1 pair of moccasins, and a handful of salt. Not everything, just a part. He turned to his men. He showed them. The warriors watched. One of them stepped forward. He touched an arrowhead. He ran his finger along the blade. He cut himself. He pulled his hand back. He looked at the blood on his finger, then at the spearhead, then at him. Karsay said, "1 moon, another, the same amount, every moon, and peace." He nodded. Every moon. Meat, spearheads, moccasins, salt, for peace. Karsay turned. He walked toward the forest. 20 warriors followed him. At the edge of the clearing, he stopped. He turned around. He said one last thing. "You're not the only one. There was another. Long ago. My grandfather told me. He came out of nowhere. He did things. Then he left. Or died. No one remembers. But there's a drawing in our cave. A hand with 6 fingers." He stood and watched as Karsay walked into the forest. A 6-fingered hand. Not just in their burial cave. At the Black Stones too. Someone was here before him. More than once. In more than one place. Someone had come to this world again and again. And each time they left traces. And each time they vanished. That evening, he went down into the burial cave. Alone. With a lamp. A narrow passage led downward. The rock was wet and slippery. The air was heavy and sweet with a scent he didn't want to recognize. The dead lay along the walls, wrapped in hides, silent, ancient. There were drawings on the walls. Deer, mammoths, hunters with spears, lines of running animals. And among them, one, alone. A man in strange clothing, not in animal skins, in something straight and smooth. In one hand, a rectangular box. Small, thin, a phone. He looked at the drawing and felt a chill inside. Beneath the drawing was a palm, 6 fingers, a paint imprint on the stone. He raised his hand, pressed it against it. 5 fingers, not his, someone else's, with 6 fingers. He had been here, in this cave, in this world, drawing, left a mark, and left. Or maybe not. There were scratches next to the handprint, fine, even. He brought the lamp closer. Not scratches, letters, Latin, scratched into the stone with something sharp, half erased by time. He made out 3 words, not, back, stay. Don't come back, stay. Or he didn't come back, he stayed. He stood in the burial cave among the dead, looking at the message left by the man who had been there before him, who had come from another world, who had left 3 words on the wall, and who had stayed, forever. Karsay arrived with 20 warriors but chose trade over war, taking a portion of the supplies and demanding monthly deliveries. Karsay mentioned the 6-fingered hand in his tribe's cave and the man who had come before Artem. Artem descended into the burial cave and found a drawing of a man with a phone and an inscription in Latin letters. Not back, stay. Spring arrived in the 4th month. Not right away, not all at once. First, the scent. Wet earth. Then the sound. Drops of water. Then color. Green broke through the gray and white, and the world became a different place. The snow melted in strips, exposing the black earth, stones, roots, and everything that winter had hidden for 4 months. The streams swelled and roared. The birds returned. Their cries were so loud after the winter silence that on the first morning, he woke up thinking someone was screaming in pain. But it was just the birds. Just birds. The tribe breathed a sigh of relief. 30 people. All alive. All 30. For the first time in 10 years, not a single person had died over the winter. Not a single child. Not a single old person. 30 had gone into winter and 30 had come out. It was a miracle. Not his miracle. Their shared one. But they didn't know that. They knew only one name. He who tamed fire. He began to plant. Wild barley. He had found it by the stream back in the winter. Dry ears sticking out from under the snow. He gathered the grains. 120 of them. Small, dark, hard. He cleared a patch of land near the campsite. He dug it up with a digging stick. He loosened the soil. He placed the grains in the ground, 3 in each hole. 40 holes. He watered them with water from the stream, and he waited. The tribe looked at him as if he were mad. Grains in the ground, why? Grains are for eating. Grains are ground with stones to make porridge. But he was burying them. In the mud. He explained. A stalk will grow from a single seed. There will be an ear of grain on the stalk. 30 seeds in the ear. He planted one and got 30. They watched. They didn't believe him. But they didn't interfere. He who tamed fire. He was allowed to be a madman. In the 5th month, he brought back the wolf cubs. Nay found the den. The she-wolf was dead, killed by another beast or by starvation. 3 pups. Blind, warm, squeaking. She brought them in a leather pouch and set them before him. She looked at him. Why? He took the pups. Tiny, helpless. They smelled of milk and fur. 2 were strong. The 3rd was weak. The 3rd died on the 2nd night. 2 remained. He fed them chewed meat from his hand, 1 piece at a time, 3 times a day. They whimpered and nuzzled his palm with their wet noses and fell asleep on his lap. Tara watched and shook her head. Wolves. Why feed wolves? Wolves are enemies. Wolves steal meat. Wolves are dangerous. He replied, Not wolves, dogs. They'll be dogs, someday. She didn't understand, but one of the puppies crawled over to her daughter, the very same girl he'd saved from the heat. The girl reached out her hand. The puppy licked her fingers. The girl laughed. Tara looked at her daughter, at the puppy, at the laughing face of the child who had been dying just 4 months ago, and she didn't say another word against it. By the 6th month, the first barley sprouts had broken through the soil, green, thin, fragile, like threads. He stood over them, his hands trembling, not from the cold, from realization. It's working. The seed in the ground produces a sprout. The sprout produces an ear of grain. The ear of grain produces seeds, a cycle, an endless cycle. The beginning of everything. The beginning of agriculture. The beginning of settled life. The beginning of civilization. Right here, on a patch of dug-up earth by the stream. Uni crouched down beside him. She touched the sprout, gently, with her fingertips, the way you touch something alive, fragile, and impossible. Then she looked at him, and for the first time she smiled. Not defiantly, not provocatively, gently, like a person who had suddenly seen the future and liked what they saw. The shaman Urka went into the forest for 3 days, without a word, without explanation. He got up in the morning and left. The tribe grew anxious. Uni stood at the entrance, gazing into the forest, her face closed off and anxious. He didn't try to reassure her. He didn't say that everything would be all right, because he didn't know. Urka returned on the 4th day, different. Not on the outside, on the inside. Something in his eyes had changed. The heaviness that had lingered there for months was gone. Not entirely, but it had eased. He entered the cave, sat down by the fire, looked at his daughter, at the stranger, at the people, and said, The spirits haven't left. They're speaking differently. I listened. For 3 days, in the forest. They're speaking differently. That was all. He stood up and went to his corner. But those words were enough. He saw the faces of the 4 who had shunned him after the incident with Enhe-La relax. He saw the woman who had been averting her gaze look directly at him, not with warmth, but without fear. The shaman hadn't accepted him. The shaman had accepted a world that was changing, and that was more than the acceptance of a single person. It was the acceptance that the world could be different. In the 7th month, the first scouts arrived from the south. Not the Blackstones, others, a small tribe from the southern lake. The very ones Nay had spoken of. 3 men and a woman. They came empty-handed and with wide-open eyes. They had seen the smoke from the smokehouse. They had smelled it. And they came to see. He met them himself. He treated them to smoked meat. He let them taste the salt. He showed them the workshop. He showed them the barley. He showed them the lamp. They sat and watched and were silent. And in their silence was the same thing that had been in the silence of his tribe when he first made fire with a bow drill. It was a shock. Among the guests was a girl, 17 years old, lively, light on her feet. She touched everything. She asked about everything. 2 days later, she spoke the language of the Grey River better than some of those born there. Ka-A, the daughter of the chief of the southern tribe, given away as a token of alliance, like an object, like a commodity, like a bridge between 2 shores. He saw it in her eyes. Fear. Not of him. Not of the tribe. Of the fact that she was an object. That she had been passed from hand to hand and no one had thought to ask her opinion. That evening, in front of everyone by the campfire, he said, She is not a gift. She is a guest. If she wants to leave, she will. The tribe was silent. Gore was silent. The guests were silent. Kay looked at him, and her eyes were so wide that the entire campfire was reflected in them. In the morning, He made her a bow, a small one, suited to her height, suited to her arms. Not a toy, a real one, with a bowstring made of sinew, with 3 arrows. He placed it next to her pelt. She picked up the bow, pulled the bowstring taut, tested it. She looked at him, and she stayed. Not because she had to, because she wanted to. In the spring, Artem planted wild barley and saw the first shoots. He raised 2 wolf cubs, marking the beginning of domestication. The shaman Urka went into the forest for 3 days and returned with a message of reconciliation, saying that the spirits were speaking differently. Guests arrived from the southern lake, and among them was Kay, the chief's daughter, given as a token of alliance. Artem declared that she was a guest, not a gift, and made her a bow. That summer was the first summer without a nomadic migration. For the first time in a generation, the tribe did not move on. They did not roll up their animal hides. They did not extinguish the campfire. They did not follow the herd. They stayed. In the valley, by the cave, by the stream, by the barley field, and the world did not collapse. He built dwellings, real ones, not shelters made of branches, frames of poles dug into the ground, walls of interwoven twigs smeared with clay, roofs of hides, floors of packed earth. Each dwelling was for one family. Each had a hearth. Each had an entrance that could be closed. Everyone worked. The men hauled poles. The women mixed the clay. The children carried water. The teenagers wove the walls. Tuk worked as hard as 3 men, silently, fiercely, as if he were pouring into every knot all the anger that had once been directed at the world, but was now channeled into the task at hand. Silo kept count. How many poles for the wall? How much clay for the plaster? How many hides for the roof? He counted on his fingers and on pebbles, and this was the first accounting in the history of this world. Uni didn't build. Uni healed. One of the hunters dislocated his shoulder while working. Uni said it, by herself, without prompting. He stood beside her, watching, and didn't interfere. She placed her hands on the joint. She felt it. She pulled. A click. The hunter hissed. The joint snapped back into place. Uni looked at him. He nodded. Correct. She smiled. Briefly. For a second. Then she became serious again. But that second was worth all the months of training. By the end of summer, 8 dwellings stood. A small settlement at the foot of the cliff. Smoke from 8 hearths rose toward the sky and could be seen from afar. He taught the children. Pea liver, under a canopy of poles and hides. The first school. He taught them to count. 1 stone, 2 stones, 3, up to 20, then up to 100. Pebbles on the ground, sticks. Little lines drawn with charcoal on a flat stone. He taught them to draw a map. Here's the river. Here's the forest. Here's our village. Here's the lake to the south. Here are the black rocks to the west. The world fit onto a piece of hide and became understandable. The children listened, their mouths agape, their eyes burning with a fire he recognized. Curiosity, a thirst for knowledge, the very same thing that once compelled him to read books on ethnography late into the night. Little Tuk, not that Tuk, another one. A 6-year-old boy named after a teenage apprentice. Little Tuk ran around the camp and repeated his words. Seriously, diligently, with an intonation he copied exactly. And when he dropped the bowl, he'd say that word. The very one. The one he'd picked up from him. And everyone laughed, even Urka. Li'i Na would come to him every evening, with a lamp. She would sit down next to him. She would tell him about her dreams. He would listen. He would draw on the hide based on her words. A city, roads, cars, houses. She described a world he knew but from which he was separated by 30,000 years. And with every drawing, with every description, he understood everything more clearly. A connection between the worlds existed. Li Na was a receiver, an antenna. She picked up images from the future, or from the past, or from another layer of reality. He didn't know which one, but he knew it wasn't a coincidence. Her grandmother had seen the same thing, and she had died because the tribe was afraid. He wouldn't let that happen again. He told her, "You see my world, the one I came from." She looked at him, for a long time. Then she said, "I know. I saw you, in a dream, before you came." He froze. "What?" She nodded. quietly, calmly, as if it were something that had long been clear only to her. She had seen him in a dream, before he appeared, a man without skins, with bare skin, by a dying fire. She had seen him coming, and when he arrived, she recognized him, and she told Nay not to kill him. The stone in Nay's hand, the first night, the first moment. Nay wanted to kill him. Li Na stopped her, with a single word, because she had seen him in a dream. He sat there in silence, and the world around him became one layer deeper and stranger. In the 9th month, the first trade delegation from the southern tribe arrived. 5 of them, with fish, with shells, with red clay that wasn't found by the Gray River. He proposed a trade: salt for fish, arrowheads for clay, smoked meat for shells. The first trade. The first exchange, not by force, but with goods. Sen-He stood nearby and translated. From the language of the southern tribe into the language of the Gray River, she knew both. She was the bridge, and when the trade was over, he took her aside and said, "I passed it on, through the southerners, the news about you, that you're alive, that you're here." She stood there and looked at him. Her face was impassive, her eyes were dry, then her lips twitched, just once, and she turned away, and left. And he didn't follow her because there are moments that must be yours alone. In the 10th month, Karsay sent a return gift, 3 bear hides, heavy, warm, the finest, without words. No messenger, he simply left them on the trail and walked away. Trade was thriving, peace held, for now. That summer, Artem built 8 dwellings and established a permanent settlement. He opened a school for 5 children, teaching them arithmetic and cartography. Li Na said she had seen him in a dream before he appeared, and had stopped Nay from killing him on the first night. Trade began with the southern tribe. Artem sent word about Sen-Hai to her family through the southern traders. Fall of the 2nd year. Old Gore died, quietly, in his sleep, without pain, without a struggle. He lay down by the fire that evening, closed his eyes, and never opened them again. Braun found him in the morning. He sat next to his father's body and remained silent. For a long time, an hour, 2, no one approached. Everyone knew that this silence was not meant for outsiders' ears. Then Braun stood up. He went out onto the clearing in front of the settlement. He looked at the people. 45 people, not 30, 45. Newcomers had arrived over the past year, from small clans, from the remnants of shattered tribes, from those who had heard of a place where food never ran out and children didn't die in the winter. They came in groups of 2 or 3, hungry, ragged, with eyes that held their last shred of hope, and they stayed. Braun looked at these people, his own and strangers who had become his own. Then he walked over to him, stood face to face, removed the atlatl from his belt, that very one, the first one, the one he'd made that winter, worn, chipped, with a crack in the handle, wrapped in sinew. Braun laid the atlatl on the ground in front of him. Then he laid down the spear, next to it, crosswise. Then he said, "I was stronger than you, now that doesn't matter. You are our fire." The tribe stood and listened. 45 people. Nay stood on the right, silently, with the knife he'd made for her on her belt. Li Na stood on the left, holding a lamp in her hands, a small oil lamp he'd given her that night when she told him about her dreams. Tara stood behind them. She was holding a little girl in her arms. That very girl, who was now 2 years old and who wasn't supposed to have lived to see this day. The girl was laughing and reaching out her hands toward the fire. Uni was leading her father by the arm. Urka walked slowly, hunchbacked, having aged 10 years over the past year, but alive. Alive thanks to the potions his daughter brewed every evening. Alive thanks to the knowledge the stranger had passed on to his daughter. Alive in spite of everything he had believed in his entire life. Urka approached the campfire. He looked into the flames, and he spoke, quietly, so that only those standing nearby could hear. The spirits hadn't left. They'd simply learned to speak differently. He stood in the center. 45 people surrounded him. His people. His tribe. And he was afraid. Truly afraid. For the first time in the entire year. Because he understood. There was no turning back. Not for him. For them. They had believed. They had changed. They had become different. And if he made a mistake, if he broke down, if he died, they would be left with this other world in their minds, and without anyone who could explain how to live in it. Gora was buried according to the old rite, in the burial cave, next to his ancestors. But they placed not only a spear and a stone in his hands, as they had done for all those before him. They placed a clay bowl next to him, the first one, the one Artem and Uni had fired in their first kiln. Rough, crooked, with a crack along the rim, but real, made of clay and fire, made of two elements that this world had known separately but had now come to know together. Braun carried his father's body, alone. He wouldn't let anyone help. He carried him down the narrow passageway, into the darkness, toward the dead, and he wept, silently, without a sound. Tears streamed down his face and dripped onto the hide in which Gore was wrapped, and Braun did not wipe them away. After the funeral, there was a council meeting, the first council without Gore. Braun sat in his father's place, but he didn't speak first. He looked at him, and waited. He stood up, looked at everyone, and said what he had been thinking for a long time. We are no longer a tribe. We are a people. The people of the Grey River. We have a home. We have food. We have fire. We have a law. The law is simple. Do not kill your own. Do not abandon the weak. Do not lie to the chief. Share food equally. Teach the children. Care for the sick. Welcome those who come in peace. They listened. 45 people in the light of the campfire, their eyes shone. Some nodded. Some were silent. Some wept. Nay stood to his right. Close. So close that he could feel the warmth of her body. She didn't say a word. But when he finished, she placed a hand on his shoulder. One hand. Heavy. Warm. And that was more than all the words in the world could ever say. That night they lay together, for the first time, under one fir, in the shelter he had built for her. She was silent. He was silent. Then she spoke into the darkness. You are mine. One word. The very one. Mine. He closed his eyes and replied, yours. The old chieftain Gore died in his sleep. Braun laid down his weapon before Artem, acknowledging him as chieftain. The entire tribe gathered around him. Gore was buried with a clay bowl. Artem proclaimed the laws of the new people of the Grey River. Nae and Artem became a couple. The third year began with pottery. Uni mixed clay with sand and small pebbles. She molded it. She dried it. She fired them in the kiln they had built out of stones that fall. The first pots were ugly, crooked, cracked, full of air bubbles. She broke them and started over, without anger, with the patience she had learned from him. The fifth pot cracked in the kiln. The sixth fell apart as it cooled. The seventh was better, but the walls were too thick and uneven. She'd break it and start over. Break it and start over. The 10th pot turned out even, smooth, with thin walls. Uni held it up to the light and looked at it the way a hunter looks at the first animal he's killed, with a pride that made her chest ache. Artem stood nearby. He didn't help. He didn't offer advice. He just watched. She didn't need advice. She needed someone to see. Urka approached his daughter. He took the pot in his hands, turned it over, ran his finger along the side, smooth, warm from the stove. He looked at his daughter, then at the stranger, then back at the pot, and he set it back down. Carefully, with both hands, as one would place something precious, like you'd place something alive. He didn't say a word, but his hands said it all. The settlement was growing. 60 people, 12 dwellings. The smokehouse worked non-stop. A second smokehouse. A third. Tara supervised all three. She went from one to the next, checking the meat, adjusting the poles, and shooing away the boys who tried to pull out the strips before they were ready. Salt was harvested regularly. A caravan set out for the salt flat every 10 days. 3 people, leather sacks. 4 hours there, 4 back. Nay went with the first caravan every time. Not because she had to, because the road to the salt flat was their road, his and hers. 8 hours side by side, in silence, side by side. Sometimes she took his hand on a difficult stretch. Sometimes he took hers. They didn't talk about it. There was no need. The barley yielded its first harvest, a small one, a handful of grains. A meager handful of dark, hard grains in the palm of her hand. But from that handful, he planted 3 times as much. And the next harvest was larger, and the next, a spiral. Growth, the math of life. He stood over the field, counting the ears of grain and muttering to himself, right, The yield was about 1 to 12. If he planted twice as much land next season, if the rains held out, if the birds didn't peck them away, if. Silo stood nearby and was counting too, on pebbles. He laid the pebbles out in rows and groups, tracing them with his finger and moving his lips. Artem looked at him and realized that in 10 years, this boy would know arithmetic better than half the people from his former world. The children at school counted to 1,000. They drew maps. They knew the names of 20 herbs. They knew which water was safe to drink and which wasn't. They knew how to bandage a wound and how to build a campfire. They knew that fire could be made from a stick and a string. They knew that meat could be preserved in smoke. They knew that grain planted in the ground produces an ear of grain. To him, these were simple things. To this world, they were revelations. Every single one of them. Little Talk could read tracks better than adult hunters and would solemnly explain to the other children that a deer had passed through here that morning because the dew on the grass was flattened in one direction. He was 7 years old, and he was the future. The first generation that would be smarter than their parents. Not by chance, but because they had been taught. Artem sat under the school's awning and watched the 5 children drawing charcoal maps on pieces of light-colored leather. And he thought, if he died tomorrow, this would not die. These children know. These children will teach their children. The chain will not be broken. Knowledge had outlived his body even before it had died. And this thought made him feel both relieved and heavy-hearted. The dog. That very one. One of the 2 puppies. She had grown into a large gray beast with yellow eyes and a warm flank against which the children huddled for warmth. She went out with the hunters. She hadn't hunted yet, but she walked alongside them. She could sense a beast 100 paces away. She would warn them with a growl. Once she growled a second before a wild boar leaped out of the bushes. Braun managed to raise his atlatl and throw the spear. The boar fell 3 steps away, heavy, dead, with a spear in its neck. Braun stood over the carcass, breathing heavily. Then he looked at the dog, then at him, and for the first time ever he said, "You were right." 3 words, but for Braun, they were the longest 3 words of his life. Senhi had received an answer. The southern merchants had brought the news. Her son was alive. He was 8 years old. He was living with relatives. He was healthy. He remembered his mother. He asks about her every morning. Sunhee stood there listening to the merchant, her face as motionless as a cave wall. Then she sat down on the ground right where she was standing, slowly, as if her legs had stopped supporting her, and she sat there until evening. She didn't cry. She didn't laugh. She didn't move. She just sat there. People gave her a wide berth, not out of fear, out of respect for what was happening inside her, for what had no words. In the evening, she came to him. She stood before him, her face still unmoving, her eyes dry. She said, "Artem, thank you," and she left. 2 words, his name and the word the tribe had learned over the past year. Thank you, a word that hadn't existed in their language before him. He had brought it. From a world where people spoke it every day without a second thought. Here, it sounded like thunder, like the first thunder after a long winter, heavy and warm and full of promise. Trade with the Blackstones became a regular occurrence, every moon. Meat for hides, arrowheads for flint, salt for fur. Karsay no longer came himself. He sent people, silently, businesslike, no threats, no bundles of peacegrass, no speeches, just people with sacks who came and went, leaving one thing and taking another. The war that had seemed inevitable never happened. Not because Karsay had become kind, because it was no longer profitable. Trade yielded more than war, and Karsay was smart enough to figure that out. But peace never lasts forever. In the fall of the 2nd year, the Blackstones came again, not to trade. 12 warriors, with spears, at night, along the northern trail, which was considered safe. It wasn't Karsay's order. He realized that later. It was a group of young warriors who had decided that the chieftain had become too soft, who had decided that trading with outsiders was a disgrace, who had decided that it was easier to take than to ask. An old story, an eternal one. In any world, and at any time, there are always those who believe that force is the only language. The sentry on the hill saw the torches and raised the alarm. The settlement woke up instantly. He'd taught them that over the course of a year. The alarm signal. Everyone knows their place. Everyone knows what to do. No panic. Order. Braun was the first at the exit, with an atlatl, with a spear. Behind him were 4 hunters. Behind them was Nay with her archers. Over the past year, she had taught 4 women to shoot a bow, not as accurately as she could, but well enough for the arrow to fly where it needed to go. Tara led the children into the cave. Silently, quickly, no screaming. The eldest daughter carried the youngest. Li Na stood at the cave entrance with a lamp in her hand, lighting the way. Urka sat inside, muttering something. Maybe a prayer, maybe an incantation, maybe just words that calmed him down. He was sitting on a hill, with charcoal and a hide, drawing, lines, arrows, dots. Here are the traps. Here is the decoy fire.
Here is Nay with the archers behind the rocks.
Here is Braun with the assault team in the ravine. Here is the escape route if they're cornered. Toke stood nearby, waiting for orders. Silo ran down the slope with the first squad. Relay the message to Nay. Position near the 3 pine trees. Fire on signal. Pass this on to Braun. Wait in the ravine. Come out when the arrows start flying. The battle lasted 1 night. The Blackstones took the northern trail and fell into the traps. 2 fell into pits. 1 was hit in the head by a stone from a sling. The rest huddled together. Nay a volley from the darkness. 3 arrows. 1 hit his shoulder, the second his leg. The third plunged into the ground at the leader's feet. Not a miss. A warning. The Blackstones stopped. They shouted. They tried to figure out where the arrows were coming from. Braun emerged from the darkness on the left, with 4 hunters, with slings, spears aimed, silently. No shouting, no battle cries, just 5 men with weapons that kill from 60 paces away. From the darkness on the right, false campfires flared up. 3, 4, 5. Birch bark soaked in fat caught fire from a single spark.
It seemed as if there were dozens of people there.
The fires were moving. Took ran between the fires with a torch. 1 man who looked like 10. The Blackstones stood in a circle. Traps behind them, spears in front, arrows on the sides, fires all around. They were trapped and they realized it. Braun stepped forward. He stood before the leader of the group, a young man warrior, no older than 25, with wild eyes in which fear mingled with anger. Braun spoke, loudly, so that everyone could hear. Our chieftain is there, on the hill. He said not to kill you if you turn back. Silence. The wind, the crackling of the fake bonfires, the rattle of a wounded man with an arrow in his shoulder. The young warrior looked at Braun, at the spears, at the fires, at the arrow sticking out of his comrade's shoulder. He was weighing his options, not words, odds. And there were no odds. He lowered his spear, turned around, and walked back. 11 followed him, in silence. 2 wounded men were limping. 1 was carrying the other. They were disappearing into the night, and the darkness swallowed them up one by one. By morning, only footprints, blood, and 2 spears abandoned in the rush remained on the trail. Artem came down from the hill. His legs wouldn't hold him. He sat down on a rock and sat there for a long time. Braun approached. He stood beside him. He was silent. Then he spoke. No one died. Not one of ours. Not one of theirs. He nodded. Yes, no one died. That was the whole point. Not to win, not to kill. To show that killing isn't necessary. That there is another way. A way where everyone survives. Karsay sent an envoy 3 days later, with a bundle of peace grass, with a sack of the finest hides, and with 1 word. Peace. Real peace. Not a trade agreement, lasting. The envoy added that the young warriors who had attacked would be punished. Karsay did not approve. Karsay did not order it. He accepted it. Because peace is not the absence of war. Peace is a decision you make anew every day, every morning. Every time it's easier to strike but you choose not to. The winter of the 2nd year passed quietly. No one died. For the first time in the tribe's entire history, in the entire history of the clan, for as many generations as the oldest living person could remember. No one. There was food. There was warmth. There were medicines. Uni treated people. Every day. Coughs, cuts, burns, back pain, toothaches. She couldn't do everything. She wasn't a doctor. But she knew what not to do, and that was enough. One winter day, Urka took to his bed. A fever. A severe one. His body was burning. His breathing was labored. Uni sat by her father's side and gave him willow bark tea to drink. That very one. The bitter one. The one that made the children grimace. She applied moss to his forehead. She changed it. She applied it again. 3 nights. 3 days. On the 4th day, the fever subsided. Urka opened his eyes. He saw his daughter. He saw the cup of decoction in her hands. And he said a word he had never said to her before. Thank you. Uni sat there holding the cup, and tears streamed down her cheeks and dripped into the decoction. And she didn't wipe them away. Spring brought new people, families from ravaged small tribes, lone hunters, women with a child from the Far East. They followed the smoke, the scent, the sound, seeking a place by the river where people don't die in winter. 60 people became 70, then 80. Kai welcomed the newcomers.
She spoke 4 languages.
The language of the Grey River, in the language of her southern tribe, in the language of the Black Stones, which she'd learned from the traders, and in a strange, broken language she'd picked up from Artem. Single words, safety procedures, production meeting, colleagues. She mispronounced them and laughed, and everyone laughed along with her. One day she walked up to him in the middle of the day, in front of everyone. She stood on tiptoe and kissed him on the cheek, quickly, lightly, like a sunbeam, and ran off laughing. 80 people watched her go. Nay stood nearby, shaking her head, but a smile was hidden in her eyes. The summer of the 3rd year, he stood on the hill and looked out over the valley, at the settlement of 20 dwellings arranged in a semicircle at the foot of the cliff, at the smoke from 20 hearths rising toward the sky in even columns, at the field of barley greening by the stream. The ears were already filling out. They were growing heavier, bending toward the ground. In a month, it would be harvest time. The second one, bigger than the first, much bigger. At the children running between the houses, 7 of them, dirty, barefoot, loud, as happy as only children who have never known hunger can be. At the dog lying by the entrance to the workshop, gray, with yellow eyes, lazily squinting in the sun. At Tuka, planing a shaft for a new spear. His hands moved with confidence, precisely, without any wasted motion. A master, a true master, at 18 years old. At Silo, counting sacks of salt and making notches on a flat bone. Accounting, inventory. There were no such words here, but the essence was there. At Uni, bent over an old woman with a sore knee. Uni felt the joint, massaged it. She applied hot leather soaked in a decoction. She spoke softly and calmly, just as he had taught her. A voice heals just as well as bark, because a voice is attention, and attention is already half the cure. On Terra, by the smokehouse, the main smokehouse, mistress of smoke and meat and provisions, with hands that could do anything and eyes that had ceased to be those of a workhorse and had become the eyes of a woman. At her daughter, alive and healthy and loud, playing with a puppy from the second litter. The girl was 3 years old. She didn't remember the night she was dying, but Tara remembered. And he remembered. And every time the girl laughed, that memory grew brighter. Of Braun returning from the hunt with a deer on his shoulders, strong, confident, calm. Not that mean little boy who used to spit in his direction and snatch meat away. A man, a warrior, the future chief when the time comes, the atlatl on his belt, that very one, the first one, with a crack in the handle wrapped in sinew. He hadn't replaced it with a new one, not because he was reluctant, because he remembered. K, shooting an arrow at a target 30 paces away and hitting 3 out of 3, laughing with every hit, alive, vibrant, free, staying not because she has to, but because she wants to. Senhi, quietly talking with the southern merchant, sending another message to her son through him. Every moon, every trade caravan, a new word, a new message. Mom is alive. Mom remembers. Mom is waiting. And one day Mom will come, or her son will come to Mom. There's a road now. To Lena, sitting at the entrance to the cave with a lamp in her hands. That very one, the first one. A stone with a hollow and a wick made of moss. She made 10 lamps after that first one. Better ones,
brighter, more beautiful. But she didn't give the first one to anyone. She sat there, gazing somewhere deep within herself, and her face bore an expression of peace he had never seen on her before. The dreams hadn't gone away, but they had ceased to be a curse. They had become a window into a world that existed somewhere far away or long ago or not yet. And Li Na looked through that window and smiled at Urka, the old shaman, sitting next to his grandson, Nei's son and his own son, a little one, 3 months old, with his mother's dark eyes and his father's long fingers. Urka held him in his arms and told him about the spirits who had learned to speak in one another. The baby didn't understand the words, but he listened to the voice and fell asleep to it, just as all the children of the world fall asleep to the voice of an old man who has finally found peace with himself. Na-Ne, standing next to him on the hill, silently, close, warm, with a knife on her belt that he had made for her, in the moccasins he had sewn for her, with a face that remained stony to everyone but him. To him, it was alive. Every crack, every scar, every wrinkle at the corners of her eyes that appeared when she didn't smile. She didn't smile. She didn't smile. And that was more than any smile. He looked at all of this and thought, safety protocols are still being violated. Manufacturing standards are non-existent. There is no written labor code. No fire inspection has been conducted. Sanitary standards are in their infancy. Workplace safety relies on a promise, and on the fact that Took once saw him scold someone who nearly fell into a post hole. But people are alive. Children are fed. The elderly are not abandoned. The sick are cured. Enemies have become merchants. Knowledge has been passed down. The first generation, which will be smarter than their parents not by chance but by design, is already running through this valley, shouting words that didn't exist a year ago. Ne touches his hand. She points toward the horizon. Over there, to the very edge of the valley, where the forest merges with the sky and the morning mist lies in the lowlands like milk. Smoke, barely noticeable, thin, new, above a stranger's campsite. Someone has arrived, not from the west, not from the south, from the east, from a direction no one has ever come from before. He looks at that wisp of smoke and understands what it means. New people, new mouths, new hands, new questions, new work, a new chapter he hasn't written yet. He'll write it tomorrow, and the day after tomorrow, and a year from now, and 10 years from now, if he lives that long. He shifts his gaze to the smoke, then to Ne, then down at the valley, at his people, at the 80 people who 2 years ago were dying of hunger in a cave and looked at him as if he were a rat that had scurried into the pantry, who now live in houses, eat their fill, care for the sick, teach their children, trade with their neighbors, bury the elderly with a clay bowl in their hands, who have become a people, his people, the people of the Gray River. In the burial cave, a 6-fingered hand still burns on the wall, and the letters carved into the stone. Not backstay. Don't go back. Stay. The one who was here before him has stayed, and he knows why. He knows with every cell of his body, which has grown accustomed to the cold and the pain and the smell of smoke and the stiffness of the hide beneath his back. He knows because he himself has already stayed. Not when the tribe named him their chief, not when Ne told him, "You are mine." Not when the girl Tara opened her eyes and asked for food. Before that, on that very first night, when he blew on an ember and a twig caught fire, when a thin wisp of smoke rose toward the stone vault. That was when he had already stayed behind. He just didn't know it yet. He stands at the edge of the valley and thinks about how there are things worth staying for. Even if it's possible to go back. Even if somewhere there's a world with smooth roads and shiny carriages and lights in the windows of tall buildings. With hot water from the tap. With food you don't have to kill. With a warm bed and a roof that doesn't leak. There are things more important. 80 people who look at you and see the fire. A child who didn't die. A woman who calls you mine. An old man who has learned to forgive. A boy who can count to 1,000. A girl who heals with herbs and a hot stone. A dog that pulled a hunter out of the snow. A field of barley turning green by the stream where there used to be a bare bank. The first bowl fired in the first kiln. A small oil lamp in the hands of a quiet girl who sees dreams.
A spear laid at your feet by a man who hated you.
A stone held out by a 6-year-old boy, just because. Just because.
And a thin wisp of smoke rising toward the sky. Just like on the first day. Just like always. Just as it will be 1,000 years from now, when everything he built turns to dust. And then to legend. And then to oblivion. And then to dust again. But now, right now, it is alive. Real. Warm. His. He does not look back. He looks ahead. At the smoke. At the valley. At the future that's already here. That's already living and breathing and running and shouting and laughing and crying and growing. And speaking softly. In a language no one here knows. In a language left over from another life. From another world. From another person on the icy staircase by the entrance with a bag of buckwheat scattered across the snow. Well then, colleagues, let's get to work. Nay doesn't understand the words, but he picks up on the tone. He squeezes his hand, and they walk downstairs, toward the people, toward the smoke, toward home. By the 3rd year, the people of the Grey River had grown to 80, with a permanent settlement, with clay pottery, with a barley field, with trade routes to their neighbors. The war with the Blackstones ended with a single nighttime skirmish that he won with traps and tactics, not by sheer news. Karsay offered a genuine peace. Urka recovered thanks to his daughter, and for the first time in his life, thanked her. Senhi received word that her son was alive. Artem and Nay had a son. Uni became a healer. Tak became a master craftsman. Kay stayed of her own free will. Artem took his place in this world forever. And on the horizon, new smoke was rising. New people. New work. He stayed. And he went down. To his people.